Welcome, Commissioners, Vice Chairman Vaughn, and State Board staff. Thank you so much for joining us virtually. Though I wish we could have all been in person, but one step at a time in this time of COVID. A special thanks to Mr. Nathan James and Ms. Catherine Johnson from the State Board of Education and Mr. Lou Hanneman from the Tennessee Higher Education Commission. They have worked a lot behind the scenes to make great things happen for this commission meeting, so very much appreciated, team. As a reminder, our purpose as a commission is to examine the short and long-term systemic effects that COVID-19 pandemic and natural disasters of 2020 have had on the state's education systems. In looking at the data and trends, the expectations is that we will advise and make recommendations on strategies to close the educational gaps in Tennessee and to modernize the state's educational structure from kindergarten to career. We're at a pivotal moment in Tennessee's history. When the world shut down, Tennessee was not prepared. Its schools and educators were not set up to teach virtually, and students' families were not prepared for the heavy responsibilities of home learning. This year has put a tremendous spotlight on decades of educational inequities, an increasing focus and awareness on the operational services that our schools provide for their communities. Out of necessity, many, if not all, educational institutions, especially K-12 schools, shifted to be the central hub of service, including providing meals, in some cases that was breakfast, lunch, and dinner for families, personal and other supplies, education, or executing also on social services, including providing EBT cards and healthcare and social services, during which time schools were closed to teaching and learning. Educators and parents have worked really hard to keep learning alive over the past 9 months, but it's been a rocky road with a lack of supplies, access, and connection affecting each step. And COVID-19 will have long-term effects on this generation of students. Some say there'll be lifelong effects. Quality instruction, quality of curriculum, and consistency of teaching are not equal across all Tennessee. Data will challenge our educational system and weaknesses and pull out the strengths, a process which is crucial to advancing continuous improvement at all levels. As you all are aware, McKinsey and separately a Stanford Credo report states that the average learning loss tied to this pandemic will be 3 to 14 months. This expected learning loss is a new blow to an already fragile system. Before the pandemic, 6 out of 10 of our third grade students were not reading at grade level. Students who are not proficient in reading by third grade are 4 times more likely to drop out of high school. 2 out of 3 of our 8th graders were not proficient in math, and 60% of our high school seniors were not considered college and career ready. Since the pandemic, Tennessee K-12 enrollment has dropped 3.5%, or 33,000 students. Most of our post-secondary schools have experienced some level of enrollment decline, with the community college seeing the largest hit, a decline of 10 percentage points. And across our full educational spectrum, if a student comes from a low-income home, or they're Black or brown, these results are shockingly worse. The overwhelming majority of our most vulnerable students have lost access to daily academic supports, relationships with caring adults, and social and emotional connection with peers. Our Tennessee students are experiencing extreme social isolation and increased anxiety, in some cases stemming from a parent losing a job or even loss of life. Our state stands at a pivotal moment. It's time once again to set high expectations for Tennessee. At times, policy and tradition get in the way of innovation, and this commission has the opportunity to think differently, to open doors to transformative leap forward that will support our students and our educators. Though 2020 has been a rough and revealing year, we are resilient in Tennessee. We do not want to walk out of this commission accepting mediocrity as the norm. We need to walk out of this commission with a focused future path, one that advances our communities forward with a number of impactful concepts that can be used reliably to guide our actions as a state. Our agenda is to do what is best for our students in Tennessee. Today, we'll be reviewing and approving commission policies We will hear from the Tennessee Higher Education Director Mike Krause and Dr. Emily Funk. They will share more about the effects COVID has had on Tennessee's post-secondary institutions, as well as some learnings from their Future of Higher Education Working Group. At this time, I'd like to recognize Vice Chairman Vaughn to share some comments.
Thank you, Chair Scarlett. I appreciate the opportunity to work with you. I appreciate and echo your opening and the vision, the task that we have before us. It is an honor to be here. As you mentioned, we're given the charge to help close the educational gaps resulting from school closures. And I can tell you that educators across the state and parents across the state are working and wanting to do what is best for all kids throughout Tennessee. And these are interesting times, but we will continue to work at this together. We're also looking at modernizing the state's educational structure from kindergarten all the way to career in order to create more flexibility as we deal with the educational needs of our students. So that task in itself will be very rewarding. I know that educators across Tennessee, as well as this group, is up to that task, and we look forward to that work. One thing that we've heard in the last few years, and you've all known it throughout your lives, is that our kids have big dreams, and that's our responsibility. So as Tennesseans, as citizens of the United States, we have to help our kids realize their dreams. As leaders, we have some things that we have to work at, and I know that you all know great leaders, people look to for four things: trust, compassion, stability, and hope. So in the coming months, I think that one thing that we will have to work hard to do is to gain the trust of those that we're working with, to show the compassion for all the stakeholders, to help provide stability to those that we are going to be serving, and ultimately to provide hope for our future. So I too look forward to it and appreciate your work. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. To kick us off this afternoon, I'd like to call on Dr. Sarah Morrison, Executive Director of the State Board of Education, to share some thoughts before we get into the roll call. Sarah?
And thank you, Joey, our Chair and Vice Chair. I will be short. I promise you have an ambitious and full agenda ahead of you, but I did just want the chance to welcome all of you again, particularly Todd Dixon, who we missed last time, but are so thrilled to have on this commission. I think it's just a tremendous group. As Tara and Joey both said, and we all know, these are very heavy, challenging times. There's just no way around it but through it. And at least for me, you all have been such a bright spot the last few weeks to see come together with such energy, such innovative already ideas about how we can build back stronger as a state. We do have an opportunity and we have a responsibility as a commission, as educators, as representatives of all the industries that you represent, to think about this holistically and to think about it first through the lens of our students and families. And I was just so impressed with your first meeting and the thoughtful way that you came together. And I'm extremely excited to see how this work evolves over the course of the next few years. I'm thankful to Tara and Joey for stepping in leadership roles, and to all of you for taking the time out of your very busy day jobs and lives right now to join us. So just grateful for the work that you're doing, that you will be doing, and just know from the State Board, we're here to help. Nathan gave a great update to our board last week at our regularly scheduled quarterly meeting, and just know they are excited and interested in following along as well and want to be partners in this work. So look forward to the agenda today, and thanks, Tara, for letting me just say hello and welcome everyone.
Anytime. Thank you so much for being here. At this time, I'll call on Mr. Casey Griffin for the State Board of Education staff to call the roll to establish a quorum.
Mr. Coffey.
Here. Here.
Mr. Rothermel.
Here.
Madam Chairman, I count 8 present.
Much. We do have a quorum and we are duly convened. I call on Mr. Nathan James to read our statement of necessity for having an electronic meeting.
I know in the nonprofit world this isn't something that comes up terribly often, but again, in compliance with the Open Meetings Act, every time that we meet electronically, a statement of necessity must be read, and then we fill in the particulars of it and send that off to the appropriate authorities and Secretary of State's office. Dear Mr. Green, pursuant to state law, a Tennessee Education Recovery Commission by and through the State Board of Education hereby submits this letter as its determination of necessity for its committee meeting of the teleconference at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time on the 13th of November 2020. Pursuant to Tennessee law, the Education Recovery and Innovation Commission must be quarterly in order to meet its statutorily required obligation of meeting on time and to create a report required by the same statute, which is due on the 1st of January 2021. The Commission had to schedule a meeting in November 2020. Because of the pandemic and because members of the Commission reside across the state, it was determined that a physical quorum of the members could not be assembled in Nashville for purposes of this meeting. As such, the Commission met via teleconference on the 13th of November 2020 to continue its work and perfect its organization. Statement of necessity was read by Nathan James, Director of Legislative and External Affairs. With that, I believe we are legal.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Our next order of business is the consideration and the adoption of the Commission meetings policy. I would like a motion and a second to put the policy in front of us for consideration. We can then, as a body, go through the policy and make any changes by amendment. May I have a motion, please? Could I go ahead and get someone to move to start with, and then we'll second it?
Sorry.
You move. Can I go second, please?
I'll second.
Back to you.
And thank you, Madam Chairman. And I would, a couple of things just at the very outset of this that I want to remind folks to remember. If you're not speaking, go ahead and mute yourself. For presenters, for commissioners as well, if you'll identify yourself when you're making the motion or the second right off the bat, it just makes it a lot easier in terms of making sure that the records are assembled appropriately. So this is a piece of our organization that we must undertake because the Commission meetings policy sets effectively our rules of order as a body and makes it clear how we will do things in the future. It defines the relationships between one another. It also provides the framework. Dr. Jones, unfortunately, you cannot use the chat function to make motions or take substantive action. So in short answer to that, he had asked that on the chat feature for purposes of recording. So if we could scroll down, the way we would need to take up this Commission meetings policy is to go piece by piece with it and kind of go through anything that we may need to have amended. We did the same process, by the way, for the Charter School Commission. It might prove a little more challenging in this format, so I would say if I'm still reading, just speak up, unmute yourself, and speak up, and we can certainly talk it through. So if we could scroll up a bit. Let's see, or you could make me the presenter if you wanted to. There we go. Okay. All right. Is everyone able to see my screen there? Okay, very nice. So we'll start out with meetings. The Education Recovery Commission will transact all our business at official meetings, which may be either regular or special. The statute that created this institution requires quarterly meetings, and this portion of the policy would say that we will set our meetings by the 15th of November of the next year, which just serendipitously we happen to have those 4 dates for consideration before the day is out. Also sets up the process for special called meetings. I would say be prepared Monday or later today to get a survey from me about your availability for December. We will need to have a special called meeting to go through and make edits to the document that is due to the General Assembly on the first of the year. So what's proposed here is that the chair of the commission may call special meetings or committee meetings whenever necessary for the transaction of urgent business, provided the chair shall notify each commissioner of any special meeting at least 5 days before it is scheduled to take place. The next provision is based on a State Board of Education policy, and it allows members who are not the chair to go through the process of a majority to request a special meeting. Majority of the commission may petition the chair to call a special meeting in accordance with the above provisions. If the commissioner wishes to bill majority for purposes of calling a special meeting, said member can call me, and I would notify your colleagues so that you aren't calling each other to do something substantive, which unfortunately does not agree with the open meetings law. So the Director of Legislative and External Affairs of the State Board of Education would then poll the other commissioners' willingness to meet and determine their availability. This allows someone who isn't the chair to cause the commission to meet. Questions, thoughts, anything so far? Section C, required by law, requires adequate public notice to be given for all meetings. Archive videos of the commission's meetings will be available to the public through the commission's website, something we did with the first video as well over the first meeting. So the quorum for an official meeting of the commission shall require the presence of the majority of the current voting commissioners. So that means since we're entitled to 9, at least 5 members need to be present for that to happen. This also calls on the chair to note the absence, and that the commission shall have the power to excuse a commissioner's absence by consent of the majority of the commission. Somebody has a conflict, they're unable to get out of a certain situation, it just is noted for the record, and then, you know, as long as we're meeting in person, it's very easy. The chair will just say, without objection, Commissioner XYZ is excused. Electronic participation, and again, stop me, anything you want to talk about or change or that we're not clear about. Whenever participation by commissioners by electronic or other means of communication is necessary, notice of the meeting shall state that participation via electronic or other means will take place. Again, these things are required by law. If a physical quorum is not present at the location of the meeting, there will be the statement of necessity, which I just read in this case, and that should be included in the minutes for such meeting and filed with Secretary of State within 2 working days of the meeting. And this next part gets a little cumbersome, but it's required by law. It says all votes at such meetings shall be roll call votes. So probably by the end of the day, you might get a little tired of having the roll call. Tara's chuckling a little bit. She's also a member of the Tennessee Higher Education Commission, and they're subject to exactly the same provisions. So there's a whole lot of Casey calling the roll. Questions on that? Okay. The next part is called this. It refers to the suspension of the rules, and one of the reasons that I know when I sent this out to each of you that we kept the comments on the side is so that it would explain kind of the difference. Some of this is sort of parliamentary language. So the Quorum of the Commission may agree to suspend portions of this policy by a majority vote of the members entitled to vote. Now remember, earlier we're saying that it takes a quorum to transact business. If you have 5 members, it will still take all 5 of them to agree to suspend the rules. Not just a majority of those present and voting, which would be 3, but a majority of those entitled to vote. And the concept behind that is that this policy, which acts as our rules of order, this policy is designed to protect the rights of a minority and each individual commissioner. And so that's the reason why a suspension of the rules would go that way. As Commissioner Coffey can tell you, the legislature requires a 2/3 vote to suspend its rules. I'm wondering that this group isn't going to get terribly contentious about, whether we skip something or come back to it in a different order or something that would require suspension of the rules. Any questions on that? The election of officers, that's already been done, but this lays out the authority by which it was done. Says we elect a chair, a vice chair, they serve for the duration of the commission's existence, and that the vice chairman shall preside in the absence of the chairman. The development of the agenda, I know there's just maybe some discussion here. The agenda for any meeting of the commission or its committee shall be prepared by the State Board of Education's Director of Legislative and External Affairs with concurrence by the chair. An unscheduled item may be included on the agenda of the commission or its committees at the time of the meeting by permission of the chair and the consent of the majority of commissioners, again entitled to vote, or in the case of a committee agenda, by a majority of the committee. An agenda item may be removed from the agenda with the permission of the chair and the consent of the majority of the commissioners. All resolutions must be submitted in writing before passage, even if handwritten. Remember, just one thing on the agenda issue. The wording here was what was agreed to by other boards and commissions, because it doesn't leave the process entirely in the hands of staff or in the hands of the chair, but creates a process whereby members can make changes. Remember also last time we got together, we talked about how we speak versus how the commission speaks. You as individual commissioners are public officials in your own right. You're certainly entitled to speak on your own behalf. It is by the process of the adoption of resolutions or the agreeing to reports of the commission that the commission itself speaks. And that's why I say all resolutions must be submitted in writing before passage, even if handwritten. Questions, discussion on the agenda adoption process in general? Okay. A consent agenda or a unanimous consent agenda is a group of similarly situated items for consideration which may be considered en masse by a single unanimous vote. The vote will pass all measures on the consent agenda, and it must be unanimous. Any commissioner may object to a measure placed on the consent agenda, and if that objection is raised, the measure subject to should be placed at the end of the consent agenda for separate consideration. May be prepared in advance of the meeting, or with the permission of the chair, or by unanimous consent of the voting members at a meeting. Again, not all the authority residing in just the chair, or the process not being designed to hamstring the commission, but rather to allow it to have the maximum flexibility. So remember, consent agendas are often used for non-controversial items which do not require discussion. I don't know that that'll come up terribly often, but in the event that it's needed, it's awfully handy to be able to handle it. And again, these things can only consist of similarly situated items. You wouldn't have the approval of a report along with a resolution, along with some policy change, all on the same consent agenda. Okay, just waiting for anyone to speak up. This says agenda materials shall be sent to commissioners at least 5 business days prior to the meeting. Now, obviously, I will tell you that that's aspirational. We're going to be dealing with different speakers who may be getting things to us not 5 days in advance. We will certainly, the staff, do our best to make sure that this happens. And we say, while the effort will be made to distribute complete and accurate materials as far in advance as possible, this section shall not like a special called meeting. Anything you all want to change about that? Procedure for voting. Every measure or resolution adopted by the Commission will be taken by a call, roll, unanimous consent, or calling the ayes and nays. Roll call vote is required in the case of adopting rules. The only rules we will ever adopt are open records rule, which will take first consideration this time and second consideration in December. Once that's done, you will never be adopting rules again, but there has to be some mention of it in this policy. Here, I'll just edit this as we go. Let's see. A roll call vote is required. Rules, regulations, of the Commission. Multiple measures may be combined in a single roll call vote. If a member objects to one of the items being voted on, then they would be voted on separately. If a roll call vote is required or is called for by a commissioner, roll call vote shall be called in alphabetical order, the chair voting last. And a commissioner may call for the roll on any issue subject to the approval of the chair. Now, obviously, if the majority of members wanted a roll call vote on something, that's going to happen. But it's good to have these things in place. Some commissioners who have served on other boards like me still, well, how would that happen? I think a majority of members can suspend a portion of this rule. If it's not mandated by law, it would be suspended by majority, and that would be what would happen if somebody wanted a roll call. But chair might agree. Matters of unanimous consent. This provision actually allows for meetings to go much, much faster when we're in person, because anytime there's an issue that's in front of the body, Tara can ask unanimous consent by simply saying, is there objection to the following? And without objection, so ordered. Once she does that, it's the same as taking a roll call vote. Except when we meet electronically, everything has to be call of the roll, because that's a matter of law. Let's see, reconsideration of previous action. A quorum of the Commission may agree to go back to an action that we've taken. Rulings of the chair. A commissioner can appeal the ruling of the chair. Chair will then state the matter of appeal and pose a question. Shall the ruling of the chair be sustained? The matter will be decided by a vote of the Commission, again by a majority of the commissioners entitled to vote. These things aren't going to happen, but it's important to have it in place in the event that something should become contentious. Vice chair, acting as chair, again, makes it clear the vice chair has all the prerogatives that the chairman has or chairwoman has when acting in that capacity. Minutes shall be kept according to TCA 844-104. The term minutes refers to proceedings of official meetings of the Commission. An electronic recording shall suffice as minutes. I'll tell you, there's nothing more thorough than being able to go back and watch it. And there's nothing more time-consuming for staff than to have to go back and summarize everybody's statements for a written document that already tells you what the recording would tell you. That's where we are on that. Questions, thoughts, any suggested amendments? Okay. Now we get into reading requirements. Again, this will come up with adoption of policies. It will come up with adoption of rules. One reading, unless decided otherwise by the chair, the following items shall require only one reading. That's resolutions and reports. 2 readings is just rules. We could have policies in there, okay. Angie, if you're with us, Angie Sanders is our general counsel. And let me ask you on record, do you anticipate there would be any circumstances under which we would be passing more policies than those on the agenda today?
Not that I can think of in terms of their meetings, because everything else that the law requires them to do is issuing reports. So I don't see any additional policymaking authority.
That's where I thought we were too. So I think we're okay with language as it is, but I certainly want to make any changes that the commissioners desire on it. So moving on from that, we get into rules of order. Debates and proceedings before the commission shall be conducted in accordance with Robert's rules when not in conflict with rules or policies of the commission or statutory requirements. The way it goes is you got law on top, you have this policy, and then below that is Robert's rules of order. I see, again, Commissioner Coffey on here was in the legislature, and the legislature uses Mason's rules of order, which are considerably more, but find themselves to be gratuitous overkill for a commission like this. So that's why commissions like this tend to use Robert's rules of order. Getting into please holler if I understand a lot of this is boring. But it's important work on it. Regular meetings, the commission shall have up to 30 minutes dedicated to the receipt of public comment. Chair in their discretion may increase the time for public comment based on circumstances. Members of the public who wish to comment will register through a process designated by the State Board of Education staff. Such person should give his or her name, address, phone number, and the organization, agency, or individual which she will be representing. To the extent time permits, the chair will recognize speakers in the order their names appear on the registration list. Each speaker may be permitted to speak for no more than 3 minutes, but the chair shall have discretion to set a time limit of less than minutes. The person, committee, or delegation shall be heard unless recognized by the chair. Now, you look at that and say, 3 minutes is a very short period of time. This is pretty prescriptive. But remember, these rules of order and this policy is designed to give the commission itself as much protection over its time as possible. And also we shouldn't forget that any time we would like to set a longer period of time, just a member says, hey, if there's no objection, I'd like to suspend the rule that requires it to be this short period of time. Then the chair or the vice chair says without objection, so ordered, and that portion is assigned. But in the meantime, it gives you all your maximum flexibility to keep the meeting on track. Thoughts? Any discussion on that? Subject of remarks, all speakers before the commission shall confine their remarks to the subject indicated by the recognition of the chair. Public speakers shall not directly question individual commissioners, the chair without the express permission of the chair, nor shall individual members of the staff address questions to the speaker without permission of the chair. This is just to keep some formality and to make certain that those that appear in front of us have respect for the commission. Any of that you don't like or want to move away from, again, can be suspended, or we can amend it out now, depending on anybody's preference. Representative of groups, one spokesperson for any group appearing before the commission shall address the commission. This again is contemplating the public addresses, not speakers that we invite. A demonstration, disruptive behaviors, please don't do it. We'd have to call security. So the next piece is where we get into a section that allows the commission to have open and informal discussions while still making sure that the letter of the law is obeyed in terms of open meetings. And that's what we call our commission workshops. So we could have a period of a couple of hours or however we need to do it, where we're not taking a number of formal actions, but we are able to meet under the authority of this commission and have a free exchange of ideas. This is done by the creation of a committee of the whole. And what the chair would say is, resolving the committee of the whole for the purpose of conducting the workshop. Workshops of the commission are gatherings of the commission for informational purposes. This disposition of commission meeting agenda items are not formally decided by the commission, but they provide this valuable time for the consideration of the implication of policies and rules of the commission meeting as a committee of the whole. The chair of the commission or the vice chair in absence shall chair that committee. So other portions of this policy are generally applicable. That is to say, the portions that allow you all your prerogatives and to decide that you all can control what you discuss. But no formalized minutes other than electronic recording should be made. The formal action of the commission is taken. In other words, we don't pass a resolution. We don't agree to a final copy. We don't do those sorts of things. And when voting in the committee of the whole, it's limited to procedure and privilege motions. And that's that. This is all the stab at it, commissioners, and happy to answer any questions or to take a sip of my water and hush.
Looks good.
Thank you, sir.
Any other comments or questions?
I have none.
Okay, at this point, I'll entertain a motion to adopt the commission meeting policy.
I'll approve.
Yolanda Jones, second.
Very much. Case, Mr. Griffin, would you mind taking the roll?
Mr. Coffey.
Approve.
Mr. Dixon. Mr. Jones.
Approved.
Approve.
Approve.
Thank you all very much. Our next order of business is the consideration and the adoption of the open records policy. And this is fairly straightforward, and we'll consider it on a first and final reading. And with that, this policy and rule are required by law. I'll call on Ms. Angie Sanders, the General Counsel for the State Board of Education, to lead us through both the policy and the rule. After she has read any questions that might come up, I will be seeking a motion in a second to put the policy forward.
Scarlett. Again, my name is Angie Sanders. I'm the General Counsel for the State Board of Education. And I'm presenting to you on first and final reading an open records policy. This policy will be in place until the open records rule that you will consider in just a moment is approved and becomes effective. It contains the same language that we'll talk through in a minute around the rule. It is based on the Tennessee Office of Open Records Council model policy, as well as the State Board's Public Records Request Rule. Tennessee Code Annotated 107503 requires that the Commission adopt a public records rule addressing how public records requests will be handled. Understanding that the rulemaking process is quite lengthy, we want to go ahead and get a policy in place that will be essentially a placeholder for anyone who may need to submit a public records request to the Commission until the rule can be fully promulgated and become effective. It sets forth definitions, identifies the public records request coordinator, describes how requests are to be submitted, the timeline for a response, requirements for redaction, and the computation of any fees. Pursuant to Tennessee Code Annotated 491-107F, because the Commission is administratively attached to the State Board, the policy and the rule both designate State Board staff to assist the Commission in responding to public records requests. It identifies myself, the general counsel, and in the absence of me, Nathan would serve as your public records request coordinator and assist you all in fulfilling any requests for information. With that, Chairman Scarlett, I would request approval of the public records policy on first and final reading. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Are there any questions before we move forward? And with that, I would like to call for a motion and a second to put the policy in front of us for consideration.
I move approval. David Coffey.
A second.
Roll.
Burns. Mr. Coffey.
Approve.
Mr. Dixon.
Approve.
Ms. Jones.
Approve.
Mr. Rothermel.
Approve.
Mr. Swift. Mr. Vaughn.
Approve.
8 ayes.
Appreciate it. Nathan, I'm going to turn it over to you to go through the process to deputize Ms. Sanders.
Actually, you're the chairman, Madam Chairman, so you just say, I don't even think we need to take a vote on it. You can just say, I think. Am I wrong about that one, Angie?
Why don't we get the rule before you all and get the rule approved, and then I would ask for you all to deputize me to conduct a rulemaking hearing after that.
There you go. So it would be, what we do now is entertain a motion to pass the rule on first reading, to put it in front of the body. Then Angie can walk through that process, and then you pass it and then say, we're deputizing Angie for this purpose.
Okay, with that, then I would request a motion for us to pass the rule.
So moved.
Joey on. I will second that.
Roll, please.
Jones.
Approve.
Ms. Jones.
Approve.
Approve.
Mr. Vaughn.
Approve.
Madam Chairman. Madam Chairman, I count 8 ayes.
Okay, Ms. Sanders.
Thank you, Chairman. So I appreciate you all approving that rule. A couple of notes that I want to make before we get into the request around the rulemaking hearing is there were a few typographical edits that I noticed. We will make sure that those are corrected before we bring the rule back to you all in final reading. And as a reminder, since this is a rule, we will be conducting a rulemaking hearing on this. And I would ask that you all designate myself as your designee to conduct that rulemaking hearing. After that rulemaking hearing is conducted and we receive any public comment on the rule, we will make any necessary revisions to the rule and bring that back to you all at your next meeting for final approval. It will then be sent to the Attorney General's office for review and approval. And if the Attorney General's office signs off on it, it would then go to the Secretary of State and assign an effective date that is 90 days after filing with the Secretary of State's office. Then the rule goes before the Joint Government Operations Committee of the House and Senate of the Tennessee Legislature. And if they give it a positive recommendation, it will be allowed to continue in effect. So with that, Chairman, I would ask that you all designate me as your designee to conduct a rulemaking hearing on this public records request rule.
Assuming we can. Go on.
Madam Chair, I think it's probably within your inherent power to do that as chairman. We don't generally have to take votes on a thing like that. You could just maybe say it for the record.
Very well. Sanders, I deputize you as Angie Sanders, our deputy.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're very welcome. I would like to next recognize, I thought I just saw the THEC team. Oh, I see you. There you are. I'd like to recognize Tennessee Higher Education Commission Executive Director Mike Krause, who I believe maybe Dr. Emily Funk might be around as well. But with that, Mike, Director Krause, I'll pass it over to you to help us learn a little bit more about what's happening with COVID in our higher education institutions. You're on mute.
How's
we
that?
Want to get a presenter or?
We can hear you now.
Go ahead. Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you just fine.
I apologize. Need the volume up. Let's try this. All right. I apologize, Madam Chair. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you just fine. Thank you.
I know we are all incredibly excited, as always, to deal with the vagaries of web technology, but I do appreciate the opportunity to appear today. What I'd like to do briefly is walk the committee through the landscape of higher education, really beginning on March 13th, the day that I think will all kind of be seared into our minds as the beginning of the pandemic. Walk you all through kind of chronologically where we are now. And then we'll have, I think, a really good segue to hear from Dr. Emily House from our team, who has been leading, I think, a really important discussion for the committee relative to how does higher education use this moment? How do we make sure that we lean into the things that were positive about this time and that we don't merely seek to return to February 2020? And so really quickly, I am going to share my screen because there's some things that just lend themselves, I think, to a visual depiction perhaps better than me just talking through that. All right. Can everybody see those slides? Madam Chair? Roger. Okay, we're going to proceed really quickly. Let me start off with immediately after the pandemic began, I think one of the more important decisions the General Assembly made and that I want to highlight with you all was the granting of emergency powers to THEC and TSAC relative to any rule or law that would affect students during the pandemic. It was certainly, one, we greatly appreciated the General Assembly understanding that many of the rules crafted around financial aid administration were crafted outside of the pandemic, and that frankly there were just going to be times that we needed to move quickly. The General Assembly did grant us the authority to waive statute. I want to share with all the commissioners, we have not waived statute. While we were granted that authority, it would be with great trepidation that we as a state agency would ever consider a waiver of statute. We have not done that. But we have certainly waived, as you will see, several rules and guidelines. First, we immediately realized that our students enrolled in the Tennessee Promise program were going to have a particularly difficult time attaining their community service hours. So we waived Tennessee Promise community service requirements. Almost immediately after that, we realized that every college maybe didn't understand the flexibility they already have around calculating GPAs. So this waiver that you see that we granted on March 26th, we actually didn't waive anything. That was more of clarification and guidance to the campuses, saying you can absolutely be flexible with your institutional GPA policy during this spring semester. Next, we waived loan scholarship program, all collections around those loan programs, and all interest accrual. We have a pretty small and modest state portfolio relative to student loans, but we still thought it was an important measure to take. We then waived fall community service, which we went ahead and waived in May because we realized that students were already going to be facing a challenge in fulfilling that. We waived in July the ACT qualifying exams. The rules have stated in the past that you had to take a national ACT exam to qualify. We waived that to say any ACT exam would qualify. And then finally, just in recent weeks, we have waived the Tennessee Promise Community Service coming right for this semester, and we also waived the Tennessee Promise application deadline. And I think what I would just convey to all the members of the commission is that this really ended up being about trying to find every juncture possible to be student-centric, to try to put ourselves in a student's shoes right now. You'll hear more in a moment about where we are. There's no doubt that we have some enrollment challenges, and we have some pretty significant FAFSA filing challenges. Tennessee has been well served by having very ironclad rules or in deadlines. I think this has been a time to err on the side of students. And so under Public Chapter 632, these are the actions that have been taken thus far, again, including Tennessee Promise Community Service for the fall and the Tennessee Promise application deadline. The other point I would make to the Commission is that in accordance with the statute, any waiver granted under these authorities, we have notified the chairs of the Education Committee, the speakers of both houses, and to be honest, in almost all cases, had a pre-conversation with both legislative and the governor's office to say, this is the waiver that we intend to grant. Are there any questions on this? I wanted to dive into this one first because I know as we're each considering the education, recovery, and innovation piece of this, we all have uppermost in our mind the momentum our state has had around college going. And I, particularly in our role, along with the rest of our team, have had in mind this has been a 10-year march in many ways to get Tennessee to the places we've been. And that the flexibilities that we've granted over the last 6 months, I hope and I do believe have aided us in maintaining as much of that momentum as possible. So I did want to start with this. Are there any questions or comments on this portion? Doesn't seem to be so, Madam Chair, so I'm going to move on. Will do. Let me just give a brief depiction of the Commission on where we stand in terms of enrollment. You will see some surprising things here. Our universities in particular have often had the ability, especially at UT Knoxville, to package admissions in such a way that by moving a decimal place 0.1% on GPA for the freshman class, they can pick up 100 students or 200 students. I will tell you, I believe that is what happened at UT Knoxville, especially University of Memphis, MTSU, UTC, and Tennessee Tech. I think we're fortunate to just have students that were very set on attending that university. And so we were really happy to see on the right side of the axis, not all of our institutions are down. However, where the news is challenging, it's very challenging. The deficit at the Tennessee Board of Regents is of particular concern. I am less worried about Austin Peay because they actually, little known among most, is that they actually run 2 quarters each fall semester, fall 1 and fall 2, and I believe we'll see Austin Peay recover actually with data we'll receive in the next few weeks. TSU, that is of concern to me, and ETSU, that is of concern to me. What we know about why students didn't come right now is mainly what we can discern by which category of student in a financial aid program didn't return, if that makes sense. And we know for sure the vast majority of this, or much of this, was due to losing adult students at community colleges. And when we think about why that happens, first, as our chairman knows, because she's also a THEC commissioner, we are in the field right now with a survey. The most important thing we can do right now is gather intelligence. Because if we gather intel now, we can take actions in the spring to prevent this from happening again in the fall. I am anxious to see those results and commit, of course, to the commission. We will share those with you. But we're in the field right now with thousands of students, asking them, why didn't you come? Or if you did come, what challenges did you experience? The early answers we have from a survey, a smaller survey we did at the beginning of fall, is that adult students were very concerned about childcare. And that's obviously something that feels pretty self-evident given all the asymmetrical challenges we've all faced during this time. But the first question we've received in the wake of the pandemic has typically been around enrollment, and so we thought that that was another important place to start. Allied to that closely is specific to Tennessee Promise, because when we're talking about Tennessee Promise, one of the strengths of the program is first, unlike the Hope Lottery Scholarship. The Hope Lottery Scholarship unquestionably serves our most elite students. It is not diverse. The Hope Lottery Scholarship disproportionately serves high-income, primarily white students in Tennessee. However, the Tennessee Promise is a pretty representative program. It actually touches every piece of our state, and it demographically represents the diversity of our state. And if anything, it actually represents, I think, low-income students in a more disproportionate manner. Because remember, 50% of Tennessee Promise students are our most low-income students. And we're bringing you good news with this slide. So what we're showing here is that actually, from spring to fall, year over year, we have increased our Tennessee Promise retention. And we take that as a pretty good day's work. First, that the messaging around the program is such that students understand the opportunity. Second, we need to give a lot of credit to certain of our community colleges that have built strong Tennessee Promise retention programs. So I promise that not all of today's higher education overview will be bad news, and I think this is a good example of that. One thing I want to zero in on is a chronology of what happened, and I thought it would be best just to talk about this directly rather than using slides, so let me stop sharing my screen. When you think about what's occurred over the last 8 months in Tennessee higher education, the primary focus, I would say, in the early days is we started with how are we going to keep our spring students enrolled? And then we progress. So if you go from March 14th, right, and then you move on to March 14th, March 13th, if you're, say, Yolanda Jones, who I know is on from TCAT Covington, if you would ask a college president, what were you thinking about March 13th? They were thinking about how we make sure our currently enrolled spring students stay enrolled. That shifted. We then began to think about, on March 14th, how we get ready for fall. Because the reality is the fact that we are back in the way that we are across the state, I believe, has a lot of credit to do to people like Yolanda, who began planning for fall in March. It was, without question, a Herculean task. We also played, I think, and were able to highlight higher education's important role as a community partner during this time. We were the state's primary producer of personal protective equipment face shields. Yolanda also knows about that because every TCAT in this state with a 3D printer immediately began 3D printing face shields. And there was a very strange day in April where we had all of the seats out of the governor's plane turned into a cargo plane, and we're flying from TCAT to TCAT, picking up face shields to get them to the Tennessee Emergency Management Agency. I highlight that just to say, obviously, first and foremost, we're a learning enterprise, but colleges are part of their communities. And when we need to step up, I think we can. So pivot out of the face shield manufacturing effort and back into getting ready for fall. How did we get ready for fall in Tennessee higher education? We deployed some military planning principles that I think were particularly important. They were military planning principles that I think also have good import for our K-12 partners like Dr. Vaughn and Dr. Morrison. At every single public campus of higher education in Tennessee, we ran a full-scale, real-time exercise in July. And when you walked into one of those exercises on one of our college campuses, or if you logged in, as Dr. Jones did, because we had all of our TCATs do it virtually, the moment you logged on, it was August 20th, right? It wasn't July 5th. It was August 20th. You are sitting at your desk as a president, and you have 25 confirmed positive cases. Let's start working the problem. And we did that over the course of 3 weeks, largely in-person tabletop exercises. Those tabletop exercises, which were led by ourselves and the Tennessee National Guard and the Tennessee Emergency Management Agency, then went into a larger lessons learned document, which we distributed to our presidents. And Yolanda, I'm taking your general nodding as that document got to you. Excellent. That makes my day. We wanted every president to see every lesson from every college. Some of the lessons were really small, right? Some of the lessons were we don't have a good contact tracing operation. Other lessons were huge, though. We need to talk more to our local Department of Health because if a student tests positive at the clinic in Knoxville, we absolutely need to ask the student, are you a currently enrolled UT Knoxville student? You are. We will be disclosing this test also to the university. So those 3-4 weeks, which incredible credit needs to go to TEMA, to our staff here, Mitch Curry, Dr. Emily House. Those were important exercises for us. As the fall semester opened, I feel very comfortable in saying we still had more to learn. I think there was a universal commitment among our campuses that for the student that wanted to go in person, it was important that we offer that chance. You cannot learn how to be a welder virtually. You can't. And it's very hard to learn clinical competencies in many of our health professions virtually. So we had to think through what was the classroom going to look like. We also had to think through that the largest houser in state government, other than the Department of Corrections, is us. We have 26,000 students living in communal situations. And obviously in the middle of a pandemic, that is not ideal. So dorm life looked different this fall. And as we continue to learn, if you followed our curve of infections, it looked like we came back to campus either, if you were UT, you came back August 19th. If you were an LGI or community college, you came back August 24th. And guess what happened 2 or 3 weeks later? We did see a rise in infections. But we also saw campuses, just like our K-12 partners, that responded very proactively. We had comprehensive contact tracing, comprehensive notification. And unlike K-12, if we had a student in a dorm test positive, we had to have a quarantine capability. And we don't have the presidents on the call here for me to recognize, though I was able to recognize them with the governor the other day. I'm very proud of how we responded when we faced challenges. There were colleges across the country that with 100 cases said we're going home right now. I don't think that was the right decision for our campuses. And our campuses proved you could safely push through, you could safely quarantine while carrying on instruction. A really important asterisk to add here, though, is the work of our faculty and staff and the fact that we were able to universally tell faculty, if you do not feel comfortable due to a health condition, due to a loved one that you're caring for, we will have you on Zoom. Giving our faculty that choice was probably the most important risk mitigation tool that I felt comfortable welcoming people back in person, because I knew that faculty weren't back in person unless they felt expressly comfortable. So we are now, for the commission to know, 2 weeks out from adjourning. We are all going to go home in November, and that is a benefit that our K-12 partners do not have. Tennessee Tech University, important for the commission to know, is going to teach a traditional semester. But every other university, community college is going to go home on Thanksgiving. We are going to use that time much as we used this summer. And in early December, the THEC emergency team here, which is myself, Dr. House, Mitch Curry, we will go back to the campuses, every single one of them, and we're going to do lessons learned from the fall. We're going to then gather all the presidents virtually in mid-December to be able to share, here's what we learned this fall. Because my message to presidents right now is that this virus does not go away on January 2nd. That our spring semester is likely going to look much like our fall semester. And the reality is that in January and February, we probably need to be prepared for probably some of our tougher challenges. So let's use December to get ready. One of the important functions of our agency, and Chairman Scarlett, I think, can attest to this already, is THEC is a pretty good convener. Many of our presidents would tell you if one president tries to convene another president, they're going to be like, what are they up to? THEC generally can serve as a central convener without agenda other than the public good. And we will do so in December. And having pollinated every campus with, hey, what did you learn? What would you do differently? We will bring those lessons back, and we commit to bring those lessons back to the commission as well, if you all find that helpful. So I hope that's a good chronological view of where we started on March 13th and where we've ended now, and would love to take any of your questions before I defer to Dr. House to talk about, the second part of this commission's name, recovery and innovation. Dr. House from our team will share some thoughts on innovation. But happy to take your questions on what I've discussed thus far.
There hasn't been any student that's gotten COVID at UTK that has been hospitalized. What are you seeing in all the other colleges?
Dr. Rothermel, it is the same. We have no knowledge of a student case that resulted in hospitalization. I will tell you, I think UTK's data gathering is probably more advanced than others. And the important caveat is there may well have been a student hospitalized that I don't know about. We typically get what we call also a military term spot reports from presidents. And when a student has been seriously ill, we have been notified, but I have not gotten a hospitalization notification specifically. We are, I think in full disclosure, need to share, we are running down a couple of cases and continue to be in an investigative posture around a few student cases that did not have a positive outcome. But I can't report right now what the status of those is because we're still waiting to hear from the Department of Health. Without question, I can tell you, though, UT Knoxville, that at one time had what would have been considered a high infection rate, never had a student hospitalized.
Thank you.
It's Chris Jones. I know this is a tremendous amount of work, so really appreciate what you put into it. Has there been any communication with the private universities like Vanderbilt in Tennessee? Is there any partnership with them?
Thank you for that question, Chris, because I always say I'd rather be doing this job in Tennessee than any other state. And one of the reasons is many states have an adversarial posture between publics and privates. We do not. So many states, financial aid that the state uses cannot be used at private universities. We've never thought that was the right move. Continue to believe all of our programs should be wide open, and they are. And that came out in this pandemic. Most notably, we conducted the exact same tabletop exercises, sir, for the privates as we did the publics. We actually did one large collective tabletop with all the privates together, which turned out to be incredibly useful. Dr. Presnell is the head of the Tennessee Independent College and University Association, and we talk all the time. The other thing I need to highlight, and forgive me for not mentioning this earlier, has been the influx of federal funds. And those CARES Act monies, many of those funds, the HERF fund, Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund, went straight to colleges. But the governor designated an additional $20 million of state relief funds that we have distributed to colleges. And again, unlike most states, we absolutely distributed to private universities on the same basis as public universities, which I believe was the right policy decision at the time and continue to believe that. So we have had a lot of communication, Chris, with those groups. I want to highlight, for those that haven't looked at the Sewanee situation, Sewanee has become somewhat of a national model. They built a bubble without question. Now, that's easy to do when you're on a mountain. But Sewanee really built a controlled environment that I think we can all learn from even at our public campuses. It has been a fully articulated partnership between publics and privates and wouldn't have it any other way.
If you don't mind just one second, I want to kind of emphasize that when he says it's antagonistic in other states, he is not kidding. The type of partnerships that we've had every step of the way, especially over the course of the last 10 to 15 years, have been extraordinary by comparison to other states around the nation, from articulation arrangements to just being willing to come and meet, to recognize that problems are shared across the sector. This doesn't happen in a lot of states. So he's definitely not blowing smoke when he's sharing that part. Also, I know we've got several of the commissioners that are not, they're not higher ed folks, they're in business and different areas. Is there any kind of, you want to share with us kind of the basic 1-minute speech about Tennessee Reconnect, about Tennessee Promise, the Hope Scholarship, just a kind of 1 minute on each for an audience that doesn't do this every day?
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Nathan. So our agency has two main functions. The THEC side of our agency is the state's higher education coordinating agency. We're a joint agency in which myself and all other employees here also work for an agency called TSAC, which is the Tennessee Student Assistance Corporation. In that capacity, we administer about $530 million of financial aid annually, including both public and private institutions. The flagship financial aid program for many years in our state was the Hope Lottery Scholarship, which is a $16,000 scholarship eligible to be received for students that have a 3.0 GPA or a 21 on the ACT. That program, and I hope you didn't hear my comment earlier relative to the non-diversity of the program, it has been an effective program. What Hope did not do, though, is move the needle in terms of who was going to college. It helped students who were already going, which is a public policy virtue to be sure. But in 2015, the governor and the General Assembly at the time took a hard look at how can we bring in a student that maybe we've never had in college. And that resulted in the Tennessee Promise program. The Tennessee Promise program is funded from a lottery endowment that began at $361 million. That $361 million has now grown to $612 million. and we utilized the interest on the $612 million to fund a scholarship to any community college, or of course, Yolanda would want me to highlight, Tennessee College of Applied Technology. And we're able to tell students a very important and clear message, which is you can go. You can go. You can go tuition free. And in the first year of Tennessee Promise, the number of Tennessee students going to college went up from 57% to nearly 64%, which is, that we can tell, is the largest single increase by any state ever. So we feel good about Promise. However, at the time, we also began to almost immediately receive inquiries saying, you've had such a great influx of high school students, but what about the adult student that needs to go to college? What about the adult student that needs to upskill? That resulted in the creation of the Tennessee Reconnect program, which, when paired with Tennessee Promise, we can basically tell any Tennessean you can go to community college or technical college tuition free. Tennessee Reconnect, identically to Promise, provides a last dollar scholarship to a community college or a TCAT. It was probably one of the best underestimates we ever did because we thought, oh, I don't know, maybe 5,000 adults will go and it'll cost about $13 million. It costs about $30 million because 16,000 adults are going every year. We are particularly concerned about this population. The data that I showed you earlier around enrollment drops, and Dr. House will probably reference much of this in her remarks, but our adult students are already fragile, and they're even more so in the middle of a pandemic. So we have underway an effort that I will leave to Dr. House to describe because she's leading it to try to recapture Tennesseans that are perhaps on unemployment right now and bring them back to one of our technical colleges. But tonight at dinner, when you're discussing financial aid, as I know you often do, if somebody were to ask you, hey, what are the mainstays of Tennessee financial aid, you would say Hope Lottery, Reconnect, Promise. Does that hit the right points, Nathan?
I think it does. Just one of the things over the course of this last decade and a half, traveling around the country, everybody wants to talk to us in Tennessee. And it's as much about higher education as it was from, on the K-12 side with the improvements in there. And sometimes it's easy to get too much into one sector, too much in the other, or, a lot of these folks are out making a living. There's some pretty extraordinary stories to be told in terms of innovation. So, I would say if you're not being asked to come up with, tremendous innovations in a state that hasn't gone on there and done that in some ways. And so it's really important for your knowledge moving forward to have this perspective.
That's well said. The other thing I would add too, as you all have delved into this, is Nathan referenced this relative to public and private higher education, but there's also a really deep partnership between Tennessee higher education and Tennessee K-12. One of my best work friends and colleagues, Sarah Morrison, on this Zoom is also on our board, and I am on her board. And Nathan works hand in glove with Lou Hanneman on our team, who you all have heard from already and who's been at most of your meetings. So the partnerships are authentic, and I think that was demonstrated over the last 8 months. And our hope is, our most important focus is to make sure that next fall, as we do wait, and I think it's fair to say that in many ways we're hoping fall 21 with the aid of a vaccine on our campuses will look much more normal. Our hope is that we return to fall 21 with some sense of momentum, but also not having lost the lessons of COVID-19, which is the perfect segue to Dr. House, pending any other questions you all may have. With that, I'll introduce Dr. Emily House, who's the Deputy Executive Director of our agency.
Hey, everybody. Good afternoon. Very happy to be here. Happy to join. Always difficult to follow Mike, but I think what you hear from me will be very similar to what you've heard from him. I am going to share my screen quickly, so just hang on 1 second, and then we'll jump right in. Sorry, 1 second. All right, thank you all. Can you all see that? Yeah, okay, great. So a lot of what I'm going to say relates very, very much to what Mike just spoke about. Since March of this year, mid-March 2020, everything on our campuses has changed in one way or another. And these 5 bullets that I have here listed are really just the tip of the iceberg with regard to how everything has had to change in this post-COVID, during COVID world in which we live. And I do want to touch on each of these points very briefly as we go with regard to coursework and online education, student and faculty and staff processes, all of which needed to move online, changes to calendar, changes to the provision of support, and then just the much more concrete auxiliary services. Thank you, Amy Owen, for the comment about the slides. Here we go. So I do want to touch on each of these just really very quickly, and I would love to open up to whatever discussion is most helpful for this group. But what we did over the past couple weeks here at THEC with Dr. Stephen Gentile, who is our policy officer, he's not here with us today, is convene a group of staff, of administrators from all of the campuses across the state, all of the public campuses across the state. So this is not reflective of what Mike mentioned about the public-private partnerships, because this was only public higher ed, to really talk about very candidly what is going on your campuses, what are some lessons learned, and really what are some silver linings, if we dare to use that term, with regard to the changes that have needed to happen because of COVID. What can be a longer lasting change, keeping the students and their health and well-being, of course, but also their success in the post-secondary universe at the forefront. So the bottom line really, and it says this on the slide very explicitly, is I don't think the goal should be to go back to where we were pre-COVID. Mike just mentioned things going back to normal, perhaps, God willing, in fall 2021, but I don't think normal needs to mean that we go back on some of the improvements that we've made, particularly as we think about keeping students and their experiences at the center. So, and the citation up there reflects THEC's commitment and THEC's charge via statute to evaluate the state of higher ed in the state. So in that spirit is why we convened this group. Stephen and I, Dr. Gentile and I convened this group to really have these off the record, but now I'm sharing them with you, conversations about how things can continue to evolve and change post-COVID when things go back to normal. So what I'd like to share with you all now is just some of what the participants in this group mentioned. Again, there were community college representatives, TCAT representatives, as well as university representatives in this group. And it really was just a very productive conversation, a very animated, productive conversation. Okay, so a very uniform, universal observation of these group members had to do with operations and had to do with process. I will not attribute any of these quotations to anyone in particular, but the one at the bottom, we were told we couldn't do it, but we can. A lot of comments about we have been doing things in a way that's convenient to staff and not to students. We have been doing things in a way that has been the way we have always done them rather than the most productive or efficient ways to do them. And a lot of that conversation centered a great deal around process. And I've listed some of the processes on this slide just for the sake of example. So as we think about the dates on which students are dropped from their courses due to non-payment or due to some kind of issue with their registration or a lack of completeness in their registration status or something like that, we refer to that kind of crudely as a purge date. But the institutions, in light of COVID, have been a little bit more flexible with their purge dates, recognizing that some of these students just need another minute or two to get their stuff together in order to enroll for the term. So there have been some changes, some modifications to the purge date decisions campus by campus, and a very large part of the conversation that we had initially with this group of people was why can't we do that forthwith? Why can't we always make that the policy, make that the case, giving students just a little bit more time to make sure they have all their ducks in a row before they are effectively not kicked out of school, I don't mean to imply that, but dropped from their schedule, dropped from their courses. Related to that are conversations about just process. How do I drop a class? How do I meet with my advisor? How do I do anything kind of logistic that I need to do on campus? Many of these representatives stated that these processes are paper driven. You still have to go to an office, fill out a form with a pen, hand the form to someone in order to drop your class. And that sounds so antiquated because it is. And there has been so much progress made moving those processes online such that the student can do whatever it is they need to do from their home. And that is something that needs to maintain as well. I'll talk a little bit more about student services and student health as we go, but changes to telehealth provision, mental health and physical health, as well as advising student support services have really all been forced online and in many ways made more accessible to students who cannot necessarily get to a health center, see a counselor, see an advisor. So all of these process things, I hope do not sound surprising to anyone, that they are critical and that they were unfortunately, I know it's not surprising, though it's unfortunate if that is the case, that they were very antiquated on many of these campuses. And the consensus of this group that was convened was, we can do better than that. We can keep these lessons learned and continue to serve our students better. From a more pedagogical standpoint, the conversation about online ed was very interesting with these folks. To be clear, there were no faculty members on this call. So just to set that context. But there was a lot of conversation about some faculty who were hesitant to dive into the online pool of online teaching, and there was really not a lot of options given. So a lot of conversation about what can faculty do to design their courses such that they can be taught in a hybrid manner, how to best support those faculty members. And I know Mike made the point a moment ago about faculty who may want to stay home for whatever reason, teach from home and teach remotely, how to support them as well as how to support the students, or I'm sorry, the faculty who are able to be on campus. Another piece of this conversation had very much to do with hybrid courses, particularly as related to engineering, to anything that requires a lab, to anything offered by the TCAT. How can we ensure, kind of the royal we, ensure that students are able to do what they need to do from home, as well as getting the training and the instruction that they need in a physical space? That looks like staggering classes, that looks like social distancing, that looks like moving anything that's out of a textbook to an asynchronous online format and just having the students in when they need to use the welding machines, for example, the welding booths. So really, really great feedback from Carol Purrier in particular, the president of TCAT Murfreesboro, who also wears many hats within TBR, kind of the TCAT expert, one of many TCAT experts. She had really, really great insights there. This is Mike's favorite thing to talk about, so Mike might want to sneak back over here, but something else that we heard from this group is the idea that the data system that an institution uses, typically that's Banner, it can be any other kind of info system. We very often hear, well, Banner's not built for that. We can't change our schedule because the data system will explode. Or we're not able to stagger our course start times to ensure social distancing because the data system can't do it. What I heard on this group, and I know Dr. Gentile heard on this from this group as well, is that that's not necessarily the case. Banner was able to figure out whatever we needed it to figure out, whatever we told Banner to do this semester, it was able to do, such that it's perhaps not the boogeyman that we have all kind of allowed it to be. And so for my data folks, that may sound very familiar to you. For my non-data folks, you may be thinking, what the heck is she talking about? But it's surprising how often we hear about this data system as a constraint. Now, to be fair, this is a massive, massive, massive data system, massive enterprise. However, using that as kind of the crutch, there's not as much of that this semester as we have heard in the past. And I think Stephen and I almost fell out of our chairs when we heard some folks say that on the call. A couple more things just very briefly, and then I do want to open it up. I think these are, what is listed here are perhaps not what we thought of first and foremost as we were thinking about the challenges of COVID, but we had a really interesting conversation about student activities, putting concerts online, putting lectures online, anything for which a student would need to return to campus to participate, allowing there to be some kind of remote option such that I really want to see this lecture, but I can't get back to campus. I'm able to log into Zoom or watch a recording or whatever. To still be a participant in whatever student activities are going on. A whole other conversation, perhaps for another time, has to do with space use, so I will only touch on that quite briefly, but really cool, really interesting conversations about how, weather permitting, these campuses have been able to use outdoor space, how to use big lecture halls is what it says on the slide, but big spaces on campus, indoor spaces, as well as implications for maintenance and future design. We run the capital process here at THAC, also another conversation for another time, but how will conversations about public health, COVID, airborne illnesses affect what we need to be thinking about moving forward as we think about building design, to say nothing of the fact that if remote learning and distance learning remains such a hallmark of what it is we're doing, how do we need to think about space more broadly? So an architect I am not, so I don't want to get too much into that, but we have wonderful architects on our staff here who think about that 24 hours a day. And then finally, just thinking about next steps, everything I have just described has had a cost. Mike talked about some of the federal relief that came through over the past few months, but some of these choices that the institutions really had their hand forced to make do have financial implications. And if we are hoping to maintain some of these changes moving forward, what are the implications longer term for revenue for the campuses? What is the role of the state in trying to mitigate, subsidize, or not any of that? How can we, not talking about financial resources, but what resources can we provide to support the campuses to make these changes? What types of trainings, what types of intervention that we as a state can provide would be helpful to them? And then this group will meet again, hopefully before the end of 2020, to discuss what 21 is going to look like, spring of 21. So that was a lot. I do talk very fast, so I hope that was helpful. I will stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy to take any questions from the group.
Emily, David Coffey.
Yes, sir.
I think Tennessee has done an unusually good job of coordinating the community college and with the universities. And that being behind us, I'm wondering if we're looking at the implementation or how we can coordinate online learning from people out of state with what we do in the universities and colleges.
Sure, I think that's an excellent question, sir. And I think that would really come down to institution by institution priorities and objectives as it relates to out-of-state enrollment at the community college level and at the university level. So I think there's a lot more to be done there. We do have a role in talking about, I know Nathan is very familiar with this as well, talking about transfer pathways and articulation agreements and what that needs to look like in terms of how institutions would recruit or work with students living out of state. That would be a more institutional decision. But that's a great point, a great question. Anybody else? Anything else I can tell you? I could talk about this all day.
Yeah, the commissioners, I would say please make sure your questions get asked. It's you know, we know what we know what's in front of us, but sometimes, you know, we've really got to take advantage of opportunities like this one to hop in.
This is Todd Dixon, and I had a question. If you all have been talking at all about the potential of dual enrollment in the K-12 world, and we've been talking more about the potential of kind of some of the learnings and distance learning and how they could benefit high school students as they're getting into the college age and what dual enrollment might look like. So,
really timely question. If everybody could, yeah. Really, really timely. As we think about what enrollment has looked like over the past term, Mike mentioned adult learners kind of decreasing in their enrollment. The same has been true of dual enrollment students, and I think there are a number of reasons for that we don't need to litigate. But I think as we think about the best ways to do hybrid learning, online learning for our regular higher ed students, how do we extrapolate that to meet the needs of high school students doing dual enrollment courses? I think there is an important conversation there about CTE dual enrollment courses and how that would look in terms of a hybrid kind of situation. But dual enrollment has been a hot topic here for a couple of years. We are consistently trying to refine that practice and make sure all students who want access have access. I think another flavor of that conversation is going to be related to distance learning. Chancellor Tidings from TBR was here on Tuesday. We talked about this for a long time about her concern about how dual enrollment is down. So a lot more to do there, but very much top of mind, yes, sir.
And this is Chris Jones. How much emphasis has been placed on the cultural aspects of this, of controlling this pandemic? You know, in Japan, they came out with the 3 C's: avoid crowds, avoid close contact, I forget the other one. I'm sorry, but they had a 3 C's approach, and it really helped because the public was able to kind of get behind that message. I have been unfamiliar with what's happened at, say, ETSU or UT in terms of how the messaging has been delivered to the students. This is how you get to come back if you follow appropriate social distancing, if you wear masks and such. Then that was it. It was coverings. It was face coverings. That was their 3rd C. But has that been an important message at the university? If so, who's delivering that? How's that being handled?
Thank you. So very much so. And I think each institution has kind of put their own spin on what's best for their students. What we have done at the state level is put together a reopening document that was put together in July or so. Best practices from the CDC, from the feds, from everything we had seen up until that point to ensure a safe reopening in the fall. So very similar to what you just said about distance, about face coverings, about just general hygiene and sanitation type stuff. We put together a master Tennessee pledge for higher education, sent that out to the campuses with which they put their own spin on whatever they needed for fall of 20. And we can, Commissioner Scarlett, we can share that with you if we've not done so already. That was really meant to be not generic in a bad way, but a generic document that could be tailored as needed for each institution.
Marie Chisholm-Burns. I have a question, and I was wondering if there was any, like you said, in times of crises, there's also opportunities. Has there been any consideration to merging resources, I'm going to say it, merging schools, merging organizations, institutions, for looking for repetitiveness, but also looking where you could get the best person to teach a course or whatever. And now that we use this environment, time and geographical space is all closer now.
So the short answer to that, I would say, is no, with regard to something as high level as a merger, right? So at the state level, we're not talking about merging anything. And if we are, I've just not been privy to that. I think at the campus level, as they think about streamlining, making more efficient, who's teaching what courses, how to get the best type of instructor, that would be something that's going on campus by campus that we're not necessarily privy to. At the state level, we continue to have conversations about hiring for our own entity, which is a little bit different. Do we want to ensure that people live in Nashville? Well, maybe not if we need to hire somebody and the best candidate lives in Memphis. So I think those conversations are similar across the campuses. I can't speak to anything more specific than that as it relates to programs, efficiencies, instruction. But to your point about the silver linings, Mike kind of teed me up for this, and I didn't actually say it. Something that is so exciting that we have been working on for the past 6 weeks or so with the Department of Labor, and Commissioner Scarlett has already heard about this, is a very intentional, very proactive outreach program to engage with those who are currently unemployed or underemployed, claiming unemployment insurance, to re-engage them with Tennessee Reconnect. So many, the vast majority, 2/3 of those who have claimed unemployment since March do not have an associate degree. And the vast majority of that group is over the age of 24, such that they would be Reconnect eligible. So we have engaged with the Department of Labor, engaged with these under and unemployed adults in a way we never have in the past to re-engage them with higher ed. So just in the past 3 days, we've had over 800 applications for this program. Typically, we get about 30 or 40 a day. So really exciting silver lining, getting more people re-engaged with higher ed. So that did not answer your question, ma'am. I hope the first part answered the question, but as we think about silver linings and opportunities, I think this is a big one. And it's very exciting, and hopefully there'll be more to come on that.
Thank you, Emily.
This is Yolanda. I have a quick question talking about conversations. When I think about dual enrollment and our TCAT, have there been any specific conversations on how we can expand possibly our training model into the high schools to expand those offerings for those dual enrollment students?
Yeah, I love that question. And I think they're not here, I don't think, but Mitch Curry and Brandon Hudson, who I know Mike mentioned, are our GIVE grant administrators. So I think via the governor's investment in vocational ed, the GIVE grant, there have been stood up a number of opportunities to do that, and there will probably be more to come. So as we think about the funds and the resources behind that, as we think about equipment, curriculum, kind of cross-tabbing to ensure that the curricula are similar, I think there remain many, many, many opportunities for that. So more to come about the Give Act for sure.
Fantastic.
To just make a couple of comments here, and first of all, the commissioners, you know, we're at a place in our work where, of course, we're working on our original report that's due on the 1st of January, and this is a snapshot of where is the state and what's going on. But as you can see, we have some partners at the Higher Education Commission who are not afraid of innovative ideas, and so I can just, you all having these back and forth discussions, and we're talking about dual enrollment, and things are going through my mind about middle college programs and the ability to marshal resources so that students are able to come out of their high school years with the post-secondary already in place through partnerships with TCATs and community colleges, as well as, by the way, those same private institutions that we were talking about earlier. So I would say that we're going to spend a lot of time getting to know our friends and colleagues at the Higher Education Commission, because of course the other side of that is making certain that there's not a downside automatically built in for the school district, that things are taken care of, so that the barriers that get in the way of more of our students coming out already to make a living where they live, by the way, and not having to move from Dyersburg to Nashville, or from Sequatchie County to Knoxville or Chattanooga. These things are being done in this state here and here and here and there. And I know many of you have talked about, okay, what happens to make that the norm rather than the exception is one of the things that we'll get into next year. So I would say you all will end up getting to know our friends over at the Higher Education Commission pretty well as far as that work goes in the future. Just I'd say a big thank you for all of that stuff.
Oh, great, Nathan, thank you for your kind words too. You all know where to find us. Commissioner Scarlett knows where to find us. We are happy to provide any information, any feedback, and be as engaged as is productive in all of these conversations. So very happy to be a partner in this.
Congressman Swift, very, very impressive. You and Mike are sharing with us here. I just have to wonder, do we have an awareness issue? You know, how are we messaging our capabilities? Money is not an object, not an issue for us. Capabilities. So are we touching the hearts and minds and souls of these people that need to go and take advantage of our education? Could you comment on that? Is that?
I would argue that we do so as best we can, and I think specifically about the financial aid side of the house, which is a very small part of what you're saying, sir, but we have armies of outreach staff who are on the ground. At the moment, they're mostly online, but on the ground in these schools, talking about the value of higher education, the opportunities available, free college and beyond in the state. And I think we continue to have those very important conversations. I think we have been much more intentional in the recent past about talking about workforce, talking about salaries, talking about, hey, if you don't go to college, you're likely to make about 10 grand a year. If you do go to college and you study this variety of things, this is how much you will make throughout your career. So linking it to opportunities in that regard, I think, has been helpful. I don't know that I would say we touch the hearts and minds, but we try.
Hey, this is Joey Vaughn. Appreciate all that y'all are doing. I love the information that we're getting. I have a question for you. I'm coming from a K-12 setting, and I understand where you said that we can't go back to February of 2020, but y'all are doing some really good things in February of 2020. So I think one of the big challenges is to take what you were doing in 2020 and then build on it with what you've done now, and which I know you'll do. one concern that I have coming forward, whether it's with the dual enrollment kids or this year's freshman class or even the senior class that are enrolled in the universities and colleges across the state, I think there's going to be, we may see some kids that have struggled in the online world. So, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see what enrollment is come January. And are y'all thinking about that at all?
Absolutely. Yeah. We are thinking about if anyone, we had some presidents here on Tuesday. As I mentioned, a president of one of our locally governed institutions said he was concerned about students saying, hey, I don't want to do this. I'm just going to take the spring term off. So we don't have a magic 8 ball necessarily to really project what that could look like, but those conversations are happening about how to keep the students as engaged as possible so there's not melt. The way we talk about summer melt in the K-12 space, there is possible that there could be some melt in terms of students kind of saying, I'm just going to step away from this and then I'll come back, when things are back to normal. And I think we all know the literature states, and I think we all know just colloquially that that's not typically how it goes. Once you leave, it's hard to come back. So we are having those conversations without a whole lot of projection, what that's specifically going to look like numerically or the proportions of students who are going to do that, but that's definitely on the radar, to say nothing of what fall of 21 will look like. I think we're more thinking about the immediate students who have done online learning for this term and think this isn't for me, I don't like it, this isn't college, I'm going to step back. So we'll see what that looks like in the spring, yes sir, but that's definitely on the radar.
Or Dr. Funk or Director Krause. Welcome, Commissioner Chisholm-Burns, by the way. Thank you. It's good to see you. Glenn, just from a perspective on your question, I think that THEC is doing a fine job of providing a good amount of support when it comes to counseling students through to what is post-grad high school graduation. I can tell you from my perspective that it's a massive gap that we see across certainly all of Middle Tennessee and probably expands beyond that as a big opportunity for us to help students understand and find their pathway because they're not necessarily getting a lot of that influence from home or even inside of the schools. So it's food for thought as we continue down this pathway. Thank you so much, Emily and Mike, because I know Mike, you're probably sitting right over there. I applaud the proactive approach that THEC has taken through this entire devastation.
Thank you so much. And
Dr.
as I said,
I don't know why I keep calling you Dr. Funk.
I'll take it though.
Sorry.
But no, thank you all so much. And as I said, y'all know where to find us and however we can be helpful. I know Lou is representing us on this committee, but whatever I can do, whatever Mike can do to be helpful, please do be in touch.
A couple other things just to kind of close out before you guys hop off and to the rest of the commission is within the proactive approach, the scenario planning alone has been obviously transformative in many ways as the different post-secondary institutions have been able to lean on a lot of that work, which I think has been really important. And something else that was brought up earlier today and certainly in listening to Mike and Emily talk is the potential opportunity and partnership between other departments. So where you got the Department of, when you have THEC, you also have the Department of Education, they describe the Department of Health, and also we have the Department of Human Services, who are currently all working in silos typically with occasional partnerships. Most recently, there's certainly the partnership between the Department of Labor and THEC in regards to making some of these connections for those individuals who are employed or underemployed. And the third thing, which I thought was spectacular, is basically busting through these operational norms where they've been told for years that a system can't do something. It's impossible for X, Y, and Z to happen because it's been system customary. Through this process, they've been able to find and break down those systematic norms and find new innovation and pathways to move forward, which I applaud the work that they've been doing. So, Lou and team, thank you. With that, so we're going to take like a 5-minute break. We've been sitting here for almost 2 hours. It's probably good for all of us to stand up, do a little bit of a dance, use the restroom, grab something to drink, whatever you need to do. And then let's reconvene here at 2:52. How about that? Lou, you got to tell Emily that I'm sorry. I don't know why I kept calling her Funk. I don't even know who Funk is. Who is Dr. Emily Funk?
That's all right. I'll take it.
I was like, what?
I started laughing, and I was just like.
I said, I assume that's P-Funk.
Yes. That's going to be your new nickname, Emily. The P-Funk.
All right, I'm going to go out here.
Marie, nice to see you.
You guys.
I'm so glad you were able to join us.
Absolutely. And I was telling Nathan earlier, I have a campus in Nashville, I have one in Knoxville, and I have one here in Memphis that if we have to use this, and all of it has video conferencing, and frankly, it probably works a lot better than this. There's some feedback that's going on this one. But if you guys ever need that or just need to meet, just text me, and I can make it happen.
We will likely take you up on that offer because I just think there's a lot of advantages when the time is appropriate to meet in person. Today didn't happen for obvious reasons, but we hopefully will have more opportunities. So thank you very much for offering that. And also, I'll recognize Vice Chair Vaughn and Commissioner Dixon have also offered locations too. So pretty soon we are all going to be able to travel the state if we so choose to do that. And I'm pretty sure I want to go to Commissioner Coffey's room wherever he is because he's got a beautiful view of a forest.
Yes, I see that.
You know what I did? I threw in a virtual background for fun.
Of course. Well, we're going to kind of pull us back together here. We have had, listening to Mike Krause and Emily House talk about the work they've been doing is so inspiring on so many levels, and it's so great that we were able to have them come and share their perspective. We do want to review now the draft outline of our initial report and call for comments. And I'm going to walk you through this. I'm going to share some of the perspective of how we got to where we are. And this is just a reminder. This is purely a report. So our first milestone moment is the provision of this report by January 1st, if I remember correctly, Nathan. And it is about the effects that COVID and the other natural devastations or disasters like the 2 tornadoes that came through Middle Tennessee, the effects that those situations have had on education, kindergarten through to career K through 16, depending on how you're looking at it. And I think it's also important to note that we will not have a complete picture. We will not have a lot of data. It just won't exist yet. And I think it's important for us to call some of that incomplete information out as much as it is for us to try to pull as much as we can where it makes sense so that we as a team can use that information to help direct us as we provide recommendations as we move forward in this path, certainly in 2021. So with that, I don't know that I can actually present, but Nathan, how do I do this? I'm now the presenter.
Elizabeth Dawes monitoring makes it happen.
Actually, physically, I do not know how to present in this system.
Okay.
Bar, it's you should see mute and maybe turn off video, and next to it there's a share button.
Yes, it's having me open my system preferences. Oh, look, there we go. Oh, I can't do this without leaving the session, so I'm not going to be able to do that right now. So if you want to pull it up, then we can walk through it that way. I have a new computer, so because new computers will only allow a certain level of permissions to review things, just roll with me on this one. So if we're able to present, great. If not, you all can pull this up from the email that Nathan sent. But I'll start walking us through it as we try to figure out how I might be able to present this. And I'll tell you, this is a conversation, an initial conversation, so please take this as just an initial draft in hopes that we would get some good conversation coming out of today's session. This is a conversation between Nathan and Lou and myself and Catherine Johnson, who works at the State Board of Education as well, trying to determine actually what sort of facts we will be able to access. And, you know, that in and of itself is a bit of a challenge. We all understand the purpose of why we are here as the Education Recovery and Innovation Commission, and this first report out. You know, I'm of the mind that the simpler the better. Not everyone is always in that same pathway, so I would certainly encourage us to have good, strong discussion about that. And so in this outline that we pulled together and shared with you, I don't know if you guys can see it, but I'm looking at it on the PDF that Nathan sent. But essentially starting with an executive summary, logically, and then moving into the legal target.
Let me just interrupt for 1 second. So I've got the update on my screen, and I'm in presenting mode, but apparently for some reason it's just showing up as a gray screen to everyone. So Elizabeth, Thomas, do you have access to where you could put the outline up, or is there someone else? Because it's on mine, and I'm not, apparently, at least what I'm hearing from others is that they couldn't see it up.
There we go. Whoever magically made that happen, thank you. I'm guessing that might be Elizabeth, so thank you. So, let me make that bigger. So certainly executive summary and the legal charge and the scope of this challenge, which given the audience, I think that's a logical place for us to start. And then walking through the impact summary of kindergarten through to career. And I'm just estimating pages here, 3 to 12-ish. The way that we had this conversation was tied to a funnel, starting at a very large level. Where do we compare nationally? My feeling is that not everyone is aware of where we are nationally. We certainly could look at this internationally, but I think it's probably better if we just stick with the U.S. There's 2 different areas that we can access information for that. Number one is the National Assessment on Educational Progress. There's a link in this document. You can go visit that information if you so choose. And the second piece for post-secondary is SHIO. Lou showed that would be a good place for us to start. And from a comparison, certainly the K-12, there's reading, math, and post-second for reading and math, but then also for post-secondary, it would be the completion numbers would probably make the most sense. From there, going a little bit further into kindergarten through high school graduation, and then after high school graduation through to career. And this is how, as we were talking through this, I would love for this to be a story about the whole educational spectrum, but the way that we currently have access to data, it really is still split up as a K-12 and then a post-secondary environment. So just kind of sharing that from our perspective. In the kindergarten through high school graduation, talking about the effect on students, again, looking at how this has really affected students. And we won't have data from this fall. We won't have data from last spring. We will have information at a national level. So I referenced the McKinsey report and the Credo report. We could use that to estimate what happened this year. I don't know that that would be a really viable tool for us to leverage. We could, however, look at 3 years worth of data to provide some basic understanding of trends while simultaneously sharing what the national research is showing, and allow the viewer or the reader to come to their own decision on what that result technically could look like. The second piece here is 3-year administrative trends. Again, looking at enrollment, the next page, enrollment, absenteeism, lost students, which is a new term to me, as well as students who have dropped out. Lost students is beginning to pop up a lot more across the nation, and as recently, I haven't heard any specifics in Tennessee yet, but it's those students who have left school and are not registered anywhere else in the public system and have not notified the school that they are going somewhere else. And there's an estimate that there's, tens of thousands of students that are quote unquote lost, meaning they left school when COVID hit and they haven't come back. I did hear a story, just to give a little context to that. I did hear a story about a student here in Nashville who, when COVID hit, his family sent him to Florida. And nobody knew how to find him. His family wouldn't respond to the school or the counselor or anyone else, just left. And he eventually came back in October. So things like that are happening, and we won't necessarily we won't have all that information. Moving on. The third piece under K-12 is the operational specific data from March until present. And this, and Joey, I might ask you to step in on this. We're trying to do a survey with our superintendents to gather some of this information, because currently it's not readily available. Things like how many weeks were students out of school, including scheduled breaks, not including scheduled breaks, because of COVID, but no online learning was available, weeks out of school, with online learning available, weeks in school, et cetera, broadband connectivity, as well as digital tools being provided. This is going to be very, very different district by district. And I think it's going to be pretty challenging for us to get to, but it strikes me that it's going to be able to tell a very unique story about where we are as a state and in the individual districts, rural, urban, and suburban. The fourth area here is the effects that COVID has had from a social and emotional standpoint. This is also challenging information to get to. There was a task force called the Child Wellbeing Task Force. There's a link here on the impact. There's some good data and information in here, some mixed messages of how it was received, but it's still, the data is the data. The receipt of it might have been a little bit different. The third, or the section C here, would be the effects on talent. And so this is trying to understand how are the teachers and the educators doing, the teachers and leaders. So, and looking at this from an employment standpoint, retention, attrition, any sort of social and emotional distress, because there is a lot of social and emotional distress, not only for the students, but certainly for the teachers and educators as well. There's also a growing sense of distrust, and certainly public concerns raise about stress and burnout. So that, from a K-12 perspective, trying to paint a general picture. And I'm sure there are things that we're missing, and there could be things that the commission decides maybe it doesn't make sense to lean in on these issues. But that's the first strike at K-12. Then moving on to post-secondary, a similar sort of flow. What are the effects on students? What are the effects on the effects on students, and then the fiscal impacts. And so the effects on students, similar sort of thing. The administrative trends, the operational data, the social and emotional effects. What's different about post-secondary is, because we have this information, is the COVID real-time response and the return to school. This is a lot of what Mike Krause just walked us through. What were they able to do? So they were able to adjust policies, they were able to adjust timelines, it turned out they were able to adjust technical systems. There are a lot of things that they did, the scenario planning, the tabletop conversations. There were a lot of things that they have already reported that we can lean on to understand behaviorally how that system, or how the Tennessee Higher Education Commission helps support our post-secondary institutions. And the second big piece under post-secondary is the fiscal implications. Because of the way we fund our post-secondary institutions is so tied to enrollment and outcomes, I think there's potential, it would be important for us to share some of that information with the legislators. And then the fourth piece to this report would be key takeaways. What did we learn out of this data? What is information that we think that we want to highlight? Were there any big ahas? And I think having that as a final piece would be a nice clincher to close it out and then lead into a lot of appendices. And so there's this, certainly the executive summary, the reason why we're here, and then walking through high-level data overview, telling the story of what the data is telling, and then getting into specific data if anyone wants to then go into the appendices and look at the individual data points. So, and I'm not going to, with the data points down below are the same data points you see up above. I just didn't want to split them up. So with that, I open it up for discussion because, I think this is an opportunity to evolve and adjust the way that we see fit. This is just a first draft, and I really would like to get everyone's input to see if we're on the right track or see what we're missing and open it up from there. Elizabeth, can you stop sharing so we can see everyone, please? Thank you.
So if we look at, let's just start at the top. First of all, I think this is awesome. I think it's a very good starting place. When we look at national comparison, if we start out with the NAEP, one thing that everyone, you may or may not know, the NAEP takes a cross-section of students across the state. It's not every student. So the real data that Tennessee has is from our standardized test. So I just wonder, I think that's a good reference point, but I just want everyone to know that doesn't necessarily represent all of Tennessee. It is a cross-section, and you can be chosen at any time to test. For example, I've been in education, public ed for 30 years, and in that time, the school that I was working in maybe 3 times was actually tested, which you celebrate if you're not chosen. But just so you know, that's not going to necessarily represent everybody. I love looking at the effect on students. I worry about the gaps in the 1920 to 2021 data. There was some information that came out from the State Department and talked about learning gaps. And that was pushed, that was met with a lot of resistance from superintendents across the state with good reason, because that necessarily, it wasn't necessarily representative of all of Tennessee. So I want to keep that in mind as we go through that. Another thing we looked at, we've talked some about the operational aspects and surveying superintendents. I think that the components of that third point there, with weeks out of school, weeks in school, connectivity, I think those are very good things to bring out. I think one thing we need to be careful when we're looking is what we look at with data, because, as I said, the history that was there. I would love to see us bring some open-ended questions into that survey if it's possible. What are you doing well? What are your struggles? I think that allows some dialogue between the directors of schools, because I think it's very important that this commission gains the trust of that group as we work through this together. So those are just some talking points, right or wrong. So thank you.
On the issue of the open-ended questions, and Mr. Vice Chairman, are you thinking the open-ended questions, even if we can't fit them into the format of this report, it would still give the outlet and the place to have that conversation? Is that what you're thinking?
Yes, I think that allows them to have a voice, and it also may give us some talking points in our report as well. If you're really specific, if you ask anybody in a K-12 setting right now, we're going to have an idea, but everybody's using a different gauge, a different measure, and it's going to look different in districts that are face-to-face than schools that are totally virtual. So the data is not going to be it's not going to be the same data. So people, I think, are going to be very hesitant to say, "Oh, I can tell you this," First grade across the state of Tennessee, I would bet the farm on it, and I don't bet. But first grade across Tennessee, those kids lost the last 3 months, and that's when reading comes together. So as kindergartners, they lost those last 3 months. So first grade across Tennessee are struggling. You can document that reading loss. It may look different in sixth grade as learning loss. It also looks different in Franklin than it does in Manchester. So superintendents are going to be very hesitant to say we're experiencing X amount of learning loss because you just can't effectively gauge that with the data that we have right now.
This is Chris Jones. I wonder also about adding to the outline best practices or innovative strategies. You know, some of the superintendents may be aware of clever things that teachers and other personnel at the schools have done to try to increase utilization of Zoom calls. Maybe somebody has used the buses in a backwards manner to get lesson plans out to kids. Have people used education clusters where a couple kids in a neighborhood get together and work with a parent? I just wonder about some of these best practices, maybe disseminating some of that information so that not only do we give a state of where we are, but also this spring could potentially be a pretty tough spring. And if there have been some clever things done in some districts, it'd be great to get that information out.
And I would say, in terms of, a couple of things with Dr. Jones, with concern to your remarks, as well as the idea that we were just talking about with Joey with the open-ended questions. So kind of looking for the best practice and asking open-ended questions could lend itself maybe to, what if we took that data, that portion of the data, and put that in an addenda at the end, so that we still have the numbers and the information that we're able to get from the question that's in the survey there, but then also able to pull the other portions there in a larger addenda at the end. Because I think kind of the concept with adding the addenda who knows how many will be there. I think there'll be a bunch. But that's more, for the purpose of sort of a historical record. If people look 10 years from now and say, all right, what did this commission call for? Well, we've got 3 reports, and the first one, got about 10 or 12 pages kind of telling the story with the figures the best they could be put together. And then an addenda, number 6 or 5 or whatever, addenda number 5, it's got the best practices answered. It's got it's got what Commissioner Vaughn was after as well. So that, and I say that just because it's very, very difficult to properly analyze responses to a thing like that, but there's absolutely merit in using it, right? So it's a matter of throwing that asterisk on there, that reference to where we're going, with the caveat that, remember, our next commission report is due the 1st of January in 2022. So all of next year is about what's aspirational, what can we recommend to get better as far as K through career, and then the report 6 months after that kind of moves in that direction as well.
I see what you're saying, Nathan. I'm just coming from the aspect of, in September, data was released that said 50%, a decrease of 50% in third grade reading rates across and 65% in math due to COVID-19. Superintendents aren't real sure where that data came from. So they're going to be really hesitant to make a checkbox saying there's significant learning loss at this time. Yes, there's learning loss. Anytime you're out, there's going to be learning loss. But to say significant, 60%, 80%, 10%, you're going to have a hard time gathering that data from superintendents, I believe.
And I think you're right, Joy. That's going to be, especially because we don't have a common assessment that's rolled out across the state at this point. Certain districts and schools are providing the MAP assessment, which is correlated to TCAT, but we really don't have the specific information, and most of the schools and school districts are not using that. I wonder if it makes a little bit more sense to go back and look at, 3 years worth of data, 16, 17, 17, 18, 19, 20. Although 19, 20, we won't really have much of anything except for we won't have the academic side of things, right? 15, 16, I think we did not have TCAT, so we kind of have a squeeze a little amount of time here to look at potential trends. And instead of estimating based on what Department of Education is using, the CREDO report, instead of using that, maybe we just provide that as a point of context, but not estimate it out.
I love that thought, and just I will say I would love for us to find a different report, only because those September comments were directly related to the CREDO report, and that was I really want us to build the trust, and I'm afraid that referencing that report right now, because it's not Tennessee specific. And this is about Tennessee. It's Tennessee guesses or estimates, but I'm just a voice. I'm just giving some thought through this, trying to build some of that trust and those relationships back. I love the thought of using some previous year's data, because it does show there's work to be done. So we build from there. And everybody will acknowledge that there has learning loss taken place.
This is Glenn. I like everything that I'm hearing here. A couple of suggestions would be, let's don't get out in front of our headlights here. Let's set the stage for the long term. So this is the first of our reports. We are a committee. We're together now. We're focused on, we want to tell you what the impact has been up till now. That's part one, if you go back and look at our charter. But importantly, what do we do with that? What's the analytics that go into that like Mike did a while ago, had a really good stuff that they put together. And it really talks about the flexibility and the delivery of our education to students. What do we know? And Chris, I like your idea of benchmarking, because we're not the only ones that are looking at something like this. If I were one of the, on the legislator, these are the things, I look at this like in the business world on the board of directors. How do I position with them what they need to know? And oftentimes you see where the key takeaways are right up front. I don't want you to forget, here are the three things. If you hear nothing else today but these three things, we're engaged, we're gathering data, and here's what we'll be back. Here's what we're working on during the year. That's just my, tell them what they ought to know there. But don't get too far away from what our charter is.
Madam Chair, this is Marie. Have a couple of questions just to understand. Have there been other states that have engaged in something similar that we could learn from? So that's one question. I'll give you a compound question so I can shut up and listen. The other things is as I'm looking at this, and it seems great, but it seems from one perspective, and maybe I'm missing it. Where's the student's perspective? And what I mean by that, I'll give you hired into a living wage job. Okay? My son has a job, but it's not the job that he wants. Okay? He went to school for something. I'm making this up. My kid is 17 years old. I do good to get him out of the bed. But it's satisfaction, desirability. Also, as we think about enrollment and on-time graduation, which is very important, but there's also progression. So I might not be ready to graduate, but I'm making good steps. And I don't know how I know in the College of Pharmacy world, I have a way of monitoring that because we're lockstep. But it's progression to that end, which is very positive too. I mean, our world has been shaken up. So if they don't graduate in May, but they graduate in December, no, they're not on time, but they're making progression. So it's telling the story, but when you tell the story from one perspective, and I think if we could have somewhere to have multiple perspectives in there, it might tell it different. I know sometimes with my students, I think I'm doing something that's great, and it comes to find out that I just messed up something else. And I wouldn't know that until I ask their perspective, and then I understand. So anyway, I'm going to shut up now, but that's what I have to say.
So I could add to that as far as the on-time graduation, we might could expand it to include either completion or credentialing that are progressing. We could add that language as well. And the living wage, you know, as far as for us, it's more like placement in the field of study. I mean, so it's not just a job. And also in post-secondary, I would like to see, we're looking at enrollment, but I love also looking at dual enrollment. I know we have it in the K through 12 perspective, but for post-secondary, it's very, very important for us as well, if we could add that.
I would jump in. I think both of you have made really, really great points about this. I would just point out that this is more of a back of the napkin outline in some respects. You know, on-time graduation is absolutely includes credentialing and certificates. Why? Because, well, in Tennessee, we're in the posture of anything after high school is college. And increasingly, anything in senior year is college. And so I definitely think we should marry those two up. And the same goes for dual enrollment. I do think that that's going to become a critical piece moving forward, especially with, and this came up earlier, and I was struck by, you know, we have a generation of high school students now who are more versed in online platforms than maybe any other generation ever, including college students, outside of maybe graduate school, because graduate programs have gone online to a large degree. And so I think if we have a population more positioned for it, that might be it. And so I think that needs to be stressed as well. But I think all of these metrics that you see on this outline, I think should and will be inclusive of all sectors of higher education, including, you know, that blurred line between K-12 and higher education. But I also think, you know, when you think about things like the hired into a living wage, you know, the Higher Education Commission, everything we do now is done hand in hand with ECD, with the Department of Labor. You know, we produce mutual reports on supply and demand. How well is Tennessee's higher education entities meeting those workforce needs directly? I mean, Yolanda, you know this. It's a part of your everyday life. You know, employer needs 15 employees. I'll get you those in 3 months. You know, that's a big part of what informs how we look at hired into a living wage. And, you know, if Mike were here, I think he would say Tennessee Promise was about moving us into the living wage, you know, job earning as opposed to just a job. And so I think a lot of these points are great and should definitely be included, you know, in this document.
From their student perspective, I haven't seen any Tennessee-based reports tied to a student perspective. I have seen some at a national perspective, which I may or may not have shared with Nathan. I'll have to go back and look. But I've seen that at a post-secondary level and also K-12. So I'll go back and see if I can find that but I don't know of anything happening in Tennessee. We can certainly ask the Tennessee Education Research Alliance at Vanderbilt and see if they're doing anything, which is quite possible because they're doing a lot of research around COVID. I have also another perspective, which we don't include in here, is the parent perspective. There is, I just saw a report today tied to Tennessee parents. I just don't know where the data has come from. So let me talk with the author of that report and see if I can see if it would be relevant in this situation. And if it is, I'll certainly share it with everyone.
I think anything we could do to triangulate, and maybe I'm talking too much like a researcher here, but to triangulate what we're seeing from multiple perspectives And I think if we're not doing it, and I don't mean we, us, I mean if it's not being done, that's a gap. People are going to look back at this in 20 years. So maybe if it's not being done and we don't have it, maybe that's something we should suggest. So some people after us will have it.
I think to kind of remark back on Director Vaughn's comments, it may be that this initial report should have conceptual or even contextual placeholders, because I don't think we understand what the impact on learning loss is at the K-12 level yet. And we may not know for 1, 2, or 3 years. And so our reports may be updates on where we are in gathering that knowledge. Mike mentioned earlier that we're in the process of rolling out a survey across our higher ed sectors towards, adult learners and traditional learners to find out, why didn't you come back? What were the obstacles? And if you did come back, what were some of the hurdles you faced that you were able to overcome, but are making your learning experience more difficult? And so I think as we move forward, again, we may not have this in time for the rollout of this initial report, but in subsequent reports, we can refer back to, this was a data point that that you as a commission felt was important to dial in on. The actual results of dialing in on that may come at a later date.
On Glenn's comments too, in regards to benchmarking, I think that's important. I don't know that we could do that at a local level because we're just sharing, individual district information.
Or even other states, where other states are doing. Yeah.
Benchmarking at a state level can be done as state by state, but they would likely be tied back to, NAEP results or ACT results or things that are at a national scale.
I heard several today from Mike and Emily that are noteworthy. One note that I wrote down was the concept to guide our student families so that they are educationally prepared for the career of their choice. So to me, getting the career put in there, that's what appeals to me about our commission, by the way. But we don't have that yet. We're gathering data to try to set the bigger picture here of the concepts that will guide our students and families so that they're educationally prepared for the career of their choice. So I thought that was pretty noteworthy. Yeah.
Appreciate that and I agree. I love that you bring out the career. So I have a question and I'm not real sure. So we're looking at kids that leave and go into higher ed or into post-secondary, whether it's TCAT or into a junior college, community college or university. Is there any data out there that talks about a kid who leaves high school and goes into a job that is that offers a living wage? Because there is a section of our kids that leave high school that are successful family wage earners for Tennessee, and we may not need to that may not be what we do here, but if I'm looking at it, what about that group of kids that leave our high schools ready?
I think I can address part of that. We do have some data, and it's not just national data, it's Tennessee data on the percentage of students who can graduate with a high school diploma and actually, have the potential to earn a living wage over time. And it's about 9% of high school, graduates who don't go on to, get some type of post-secondary credential, even if it's, brief, very specific on-the-job training or an apprenticeship, type thing like that. I think that what we have done, and one of the reasons for Tennessee Promise, when it rolled out, was the problem with rolling out of high school into a job is, what if the job goes away? You don't have paper. And, one of the things that we encourage the most about going to a TCAT, going to a community college, is persist until you have the paper. So even if a job comes calling, and, oftentimes this happens, and I know President Jones deals with this all the time, is poaching, right? Poaching our students when they get trained enough to do the job the employer wants. And our response, and to be honest, we've had pretty good working relationships with employers to encourage, let them finish. Hire them on part-time, subsidize their education, but let them get the paper. But if the job goes away, they're marketable as potential employees. It's a hard sell, but in the end, I think it goes to, what was originally behind Promise and even, going back further, changing the culture around what is college and what is the value that college brings. Well, college is anything after high school, and all it does is kind of influence generational change on families.
I want to pick up with something that Lou said, and this is Marie. And I haven't looked at these data sets, but I hope that we could get this down to subgroup level, race, maybe even age, because there are disparities that I think that we need to call out so we could address them. And so I can appreciate that remark about what Lou made about, approaching people really quickly and taking them away from the long-term goal for a short-term fix. And we might see some disparities associated with that. So I'm excited about what we're doing. I think at some point we're going to have to collect, not we, but at some point it needs to be collected, Tennessee's data, to really see what our issues are and how we can address that. But I just don't want to see it at a granular level without having the opportunity to look down at subpopulations.
Information exists at both the THEC level as well as the K-12 level. And specifically call-outs tied to race, English learners, and household income. I don't know if we have household income at a post-secondary level. We do.
Only have income level, but one of the most interesting disparities is geographic. It is truly one of the most telling, metrics that our students face. And it's not just rural versus urban. I mean, there are many different levels of rural and urban, across the state. And so, we do track that. We've actually done studies down to the zip code level and can tell you, attainment levels and directional movement of students. It's really a telling story that I think would be worth the commission's time to hear at a later meeting to get a rundown on that. Be happy to make that happen.
Let me ask a clarifying question, because I just heard that we do have information available K-12. If we have it for this year, I don't know where to get it. It is, I think a lot of those pieces of data have been collected in years past. I'm not sure they exist for this year. And this is one of the points that Commissioner Vaughn was making previously, is that I would say, many of you on this commission are very, very, very data motivated, and that's tremendous. But we also have to remember that part of what we're going to be doing is pointing out where the data doesn't exist or the troubles that we have obtaining it, right? Because we're looking at Tennessee for right now with what's available, and it's got to be done by 1 January. And so where the collection is not robust enough, or the breakdown and reporting that exists, that's also part of our charge, by the way, to say, hey, we have, yes, where higher ed can provide us a dashboard and we can see every bit of it. There are obvious situations that are existing in the K-12 world where there's reluctance to share in some cases because of other situations that may have gone on, or it was never being asked for in the first place. And I would say, Commissioner Vaughn, am I saying that incorrectly, or is there more of it than what I'm getting?
No, I think that summarizes it very well. I think there's a lot of good data out there right now that's historical, and we know some things about about the pandemic, that how, who has access, who has this. But for us to try to tag learning loss right now, and because of lack of assessment, I think that would impede our work if we try to go down that road too fast. It's coming. I mean, there will be I will be shocked if there's not an assessment this year that will give us the data that we will need to see. But I think you're spot on.
And to be clear, I mean, another thing that's happened just last week is the State Board of Education passed a resolution that, yes, calls for no punitive action to be taken as a result of this year's assessments, but also says it's absolutely essential to have assessments. So we'll have to see how all of that comes around. I want to control expectations in terms of K-12 data availability for the period of time we are discussing. Because I think, and y'all tell me if I'm wrong, I think there's probably going to be several places where, we've had the data in the past, we don't have it now, or we would like to have this data, the apparatus doesn't get to create it. And in that way, we're pointing out what ought to be, what we ought to have, what we wish we had, what's needed for next time.
This is Glenn. Maybe this is not a good time to bring this up, but I'm just struck by a lot of good operational kind of things we could be doing rather than all 9 of us focus on item by item. Do we envision that we would have sub-teams, sub-groups that would work on different issues and go gather this? And because obviously the data is somewhere. Does that make sense, or how do we want to operationalize going forward?
That's a good idea, Glenn. If we want to break up into subcommittees to focus on certain K-12 versus post-secondary, we will need to come back together and merge those worlds together for a draft report, which we would need to be reviewing the middle of next month. But I think that would be a spectacular idea. I don't know if there's any other subcommittees within that space, Nathan, that you would think of that would make sense. Or Lou?
I would propose more. I think we should have primary, secondary, and post-grad. Not post-grad from the college perspective, but from the high school, from K-12. I do think that what goes on in the elementary schools is quite different than what goes on when you get to the upper grades. And so I would like to see that broken out that way. And I think that's a great idea to have a subcommittee or sub-work on that so we can focus in those areas.
So I would ask the commissioners just what may not be something that they're thinking of, but it seems to me that first of all, that you're talking about steps that would probably be more appropriate for the aspirational report for next year. Subcommittees of a 9-member commission, assigning them each to take on a portion of this report. And every time any one of those meets, it requires a minimum of 1 week's public notice. It requires us doing everything for that group that we do for this group. And I've got to do the same thing for the BEP review committee. We all have to do the same thing for the State Board of Education meetings. And there are 12 members of staff for the State Board of Education. So I think in terms of what's capable to be done in a legal way, a subcommittee on those things in terms of innovation, when you have a year between the time they're appointed and the time it all has to be brought together and voted on by members, might be doable. But I don't think that that's a possibility given, it's myself, Elizabeth, I was running things. We've got Catherine helping to put together the report, in addition to all the 51 standards, in addition to, we're small team. So.
Never intended that this was for this report. I just was simply raising a question. As we're learning more, are all 9 of us going to drive the same, hit the same hammer, the same nail, or are we going to how are we going to organize our work? I was just using that.
Sure. And I think that's an awesome idea in terms of next year. I just I had a bit of a heart palpitation there. Like, how was I going to even get it organized for 2 weeks from now?
How our work done? For example, last meeting, our first meeting, we talked a lot about visioning. What would be the vision? What does success look like? We answer the questions that we were chartered, but maybe that'd be kind of a neat activity. A couple people could think about, get them, and then get the commissioners all together to agree on. Just a way of getting our work done is all.
It sounds like you might be interested in maybe a retreat. I mean, one of the things to think about also, and this kind of conversation we're having right now is actually a very good example of a workshop kind of thing. We're able to go back and forth a little bit more informally. But, I'll tell you, just in terms of my pace of work and some of those things, and Lou's as well. And we didn't get to meet Lou last time. This man's an incredible intellect, and I'm really pleased that he's agreed to work with us on this. But when we get into legislative session, our jobs get fairly huge at that point in time. And then so, I'm thinking in terms of the potential of a retreat at some point in time where we could take a day and do some of that sort of informal work. But, I would think practically we'd be looking at probably sometime in the summer before that can happen, or at least after the adjournment of the legislature. But in terms of subcommittees in general, I think that's not a bad idea. I'm so glad you don't want that for January.
So I love the idea of us forming a committee vision and also kind of a working framework of how to move forward, essentially a blueprint of how to operate. Do you propose that we kind of leave that into our January meeting? And maybe there's opportunities for some discussion in advance of that. But in the next 6 weeks or so, we've got to deliver this report. And so let's try to get heads down. Nathan and Lou are doing the majority of the data selection and pull, or their teams are, and we'll craft the initial report to review. I think that review process will be important for all of us to go through, certainly in looking at the data, and then also looking at what is being called out. I think that'll be an important discussion because this is essentially this report is our report.
Absolutely, I agree with what you're saying there. Yes.
Okay.
And commissioners and Madam Chair, I also think that kind of to tag along what was said is that we want to be bold, I believe, and sort of call it the way we see it with justification of the data and concerns. It's a good time.
Great.
That loud and clear in our last meeting, and so I appreciate that. Todd, I would love to hear from you and Frank, because in this discussion I haven't heard from either of you, and I just want to give you a chance for both of you to speak up as well.
Sure. It's been super interesting. I think when I think about the point of the document, it's really to give the legislators a sense of like what's the impact of COVID. And when I first read it, the thing that seemed like to be the main headline is that it's exacerbated inequities, which I'm glad you brought up, Marie. So I think just making sure that I'm not sure exactly how we pull that out data-wise, but I think that's really important that we show that, that inequities have been exacerbated. And then secondly, when I read it, I think we also need fiscal impact at the K-12 level. When I read it, it looks like it's just at the post-secondary level. So just either I'm confused when I read it, but it seems like we certainly want to have that fiscal impact on the K-12 system as well.
Offer some perspective on the K-12 situation. situation.
I'm sorry,
Interesting.
hold on 1 second, Nathan. Frank, I think you were trying to step in there for a second. We couldn't hear what you were saying. We still can't hear you. No. Clear.
Okay, good. This pandemic has been tough on everybody, and everybody's been stressed out by it. But it's the weakest in our society that's been hurt the hardest, and that's what we're seeing in the education thing too. And so we're going to have a big focus on that. And then this report is due in January, and so I mean I can think of a lot of things that I'd like to see in the report, but we are on a short fuse. So really, I went through the outline, and I think that it's a lot of good information. But trying to locate all this data that's going to back up this information is going to be kind of a challenge in itself. So, I think we'll accomplish a lot next year. But I think this first report, all we can do is tell them, this is kind of what we see right now, and once we get more information throughout the year, we'll be able to give them a lot better picture a year from now, and then have some ideas. Well, what do you do in terms of improving education? And I like the whole innovation concept. I look at this and I've had questions from the beginning. Why can't we, if we're going to do online education, why can't we have the best instructors in the world teaching these classes and all that? And so I see a lot of potential there. But this first report is on a short fuse, my opinion.
You just made me think of something interesting, which may or may not make sense for this report, Nathan, but understanding some of the policies that currently exist that are required. For example, at least in K-12, it's required for students to go to school for 6.5 hours a day. It's required for students to go to school for at least 180 days a year. It's required for the teacher-student ratio is still required at whatever the grade level bands are. Those might be important things to call out as part of this factual report. So
go on. I was just going to say yes, definitely. That's certainly one of the things that happened just in the same way that the Higher Education Commission was given that emergency rulemaking authority over higher ed. Literally from the day that bill passed the standing committees of jurisdiction, we began the same process, vetting and making, talking with superintendents and school board members and teachers and folks all over the state in terms of the emergency rules that the State Board of Education had to do on the K-12 side. And one of them, for example, is the 6.5 hour a day. As a policy person, I look at that and say, well, attendance is incredibly important. You've got to have some time there. Then as a parent, what that translates into is each of my boys sitting in front of respective computers for hours on end. And if they're not there, then they're counted as absent because the law requires that 6.5 hours. And so bringing both of those perspectives to light is certainly important. On the question of financial impact for K-12, this is an interesting one. The top priority of the BEP review committee was a whole harmless provision for K through 12 systems. But at the same time, there exists no accurate fiscal model as to what that's going to look like. Because the best I can tell, or at least I haven't seen the numbers, we don't know how many fewer students each of the districts have. Now, perhaps they do. I haven't seen it. And, Representative Coffey can make reference to it when you're talking about changing a funding formula or you're talking about doing something legislatively to hold an entire swath of political subdivisions harmless. That requires the expenditure of state dollars. And the Constitution says you have to have an accurate estimate of what that will cost. I guarantee you those bills will be introduced, but the first of those bills won't be introduced until probably the 15th of January. So that's one of the strong piece-by-piece analysis will have to be done to answer that question about what is the fiscal impact. So you can address it, but we're probably not going to be able to address it with specificity in a way that is verifiable.
Nathan, I can tell you that across the state, kindergarten numbers are very low, are down, and it's referenced in here, lost kids. There are lost kids, and that's going to impact BEP.
Absolutely.
Discussion. I think next steps it will be that based on this feedback, we'll go ahead and update the outline and have it sent back to everyone for any sort of further comments while the teams still continue down the pathway of collecting what data we are able to collect, simultaneously calling out the data that is not available. And then certainly searching out other ways of getting information, whether that's a superintendent survey, trying to access student perspective or parent perspective. There's a lot of value in all the different perspectives. The question is, what data are we going to be able to access in this short period of time? So that, I think, will be the next steps for this initiative. So thank you so much for this really fantastic discussion. Next on the agenda is the proposed 2021 meeting dates. We've got February 12th, May 14th, August 16th, and November 5th that have been proposed. And I'm looking for a motion to adopt those proposed dates. When you do make a motion, please remember to state your name first so that Mr. Bishop is able to add it to the notes.
This is Glenn Swift. I move we accept those dates.
Yolanda Jones, second.
Excellent. Mr. Griffin, do you mind giving a roll call? Do you do the roll call? No, you don't need to. Sorry, never mind. Go on, Mr. Griffin.
Dr. Burns.
Okay.
She's giving a thumbs up.
We all see a thumbs up.
Yep.
Mr. Coffey.
Aye.
Aye.
Dr. Jones. Dr. Jones. Jones.
Aye.
Aye.
Mr. Vaughn. Madam Chairman, I count 8 ayes.
Thank you very much. I think this has been a really fantastic discussion. I shared with Nathan and Lou several times. I wish it was easier for all of us to pick up the phone and talk to each other, but we live in this reality of sitting on a commission and only being able to talk when we get together in events like this. So I appreciate the great conversation, and I do agree with what Mary and many of you have shared with us in the past meeting. It's important for us to speak the truth. It's important for us to be bold in our discussions. It strikes me that everyone's in the same place. I think we're also very conscious that there's a fascinating dynamic that exists in education, and we need to do what's right for kids. And keeping the students of Tennessee, regardless of their age, at the center of our conversations, our filters, our discussions, it allows us to think about things and have discussions at a different level, because that's really why we're all here. It has everything to do with the kids of Tennessee and the future of Tennessee. I do encourage all of you that if you have additional agenda items, as Nathan will send out agendas in the future, to please include those or proactively send them to Nathan to have them included in future meetings. Having Mike and Emily from THAC and the discussion afterwards was quite inspiring, and I think it would be valuable for us on a regular basis, if anyone's available, to have expert discussion and conversations. I wouldn't necessarily say for 2.5 hours, but maybe we could set up, hour-long special meetings where we bring in an expert that we can all learn from. There's been plenty of commissioners and even secretaries of education that we could learn at a much broader level. We could also dive down a little bit deeper in certain areas too. So I think as we move into 21, keeping the ideas of the people that you'd like to hear from and potentially have a Q&A session with them, I think could be a great way to help feed our collective thinking. Everyone's been very, very open with sharing articles and reports, which I really encourage all of us to continue doing. I think I certainly have learned a lot. Most recently, Dr. Jones sent out information about mindfulness, and I know of a great school here in Nashville, a couple of them that are focusing on mindfulness, and certainly Todd's school focusing on the social and emotional learning. There's a lot of great things that are happening across the state, and just helping us learn and learn from each other, I think, is a lot of value. So those are the two things. There will be a survey coming out for next month. We're hoping to have actually Commissioner Schwinn come and speak with us next month. So similar to having THEC come and provide their input and guidance, we'd like to have the same thing come from the Department of Education and talking about K-12. That is something that Nathan and team are actively trying to help us with, and so be on the lookout for that request. Sounds like we have an interest in doing a retreat. We'd rather us not have to wait till summer, but, we're living in weird times, and I don't think any of us are going to want to sit on Zoom for, 48 hours. That would be a little bit much on so many levels. And so if there's innovative ways, whether this is, if we get together more than, quarterly, obviously if we have experts come and talk with us, maybe it just allows us to build these connections and learn from each other as we go. I always welcome advice and guidance from any teams I'm working with. In this scenario, you can filter those through Nathan. I look forward to seeing you all soon. If there's anything in closing before I end, anyone have any comments or questions before we finish up?
Oh, how you got the halo over your head.
Yes, strategically placed, David.
Leadership, it makes a big difference. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate everyone here and all of you who are feeding this very, very important effort that we have been tasked with. And a special thanks to Vice Chair Vaughn for his support in providing certainly the broader perspective in the K-12 environment, and to the State Board of Education and THEC teams for all the help they've provided too. So with that, I will wish you all an amazing, safe Thanksgiving, and be on the lookout for information from Nathan for our next meeting in December, as well as updates to the outline, and in the very short future, there will be a draft for us to review as well. Thank you all. You have 1 minute before this meeting is over. Bye. Thank you.